Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where the strangest chapters of natural history have a way of finding us right when we need them most. Imagine a shoreline. Not the shoreline of any place you have ever stood, but one from a world so old that the continents themselves were arranged like furniture. Nobody has moved back into position yet. It is 242 million years ago. The water is warm and shallow, greenish and clear in the shallows, darker where the lagoon deepens. The air smells of brine and something faintly sulphurous from the low oxygen water below. There are no birds, no flowers. The land nearby is low and scrubby, covered in ferns and early cycads, and the skies are pale blue that looks almost familiar, almost like home, except that nothing about this world is quite home. And at the edge of that lagoon, where the water is maybe a metre deep, and the light filters down through the surface in long, slow columns, something is waiting. You would see the body first if you were watching from the bank. Compact, low-slung, roughly the size of a large dog, short, sprawling limbs, a long tail trailing behind in the silt. It looks, for a moment, like a lizard. A big one, but a lizard. And then your eyes travel forward from the body and they keep travelling and they keep going, and you realise that what you thought was a neck is still going, still extending out over the water, reaching, until it ends in a small triangular head hovering somewhere in the middle distance with the patience of something that has been doing this for a very long time. The neck alone, in a large adult, could reach around 3 metres. The total animal, from the tip of that improbable head to the end of its tail, was roughly 6 metres long, and half of that length, give or take, was neck. This is Tanystropheus, and it is one of the strangest animals that ever lived on this planet. Tonight we are going to spend some time with it. We are going to go back to the warm shores of the Tethys Sea, to a mountain in Switzerland that was once the floor of a tropical lagoon, and to the long and genuinely confusing history of scientists trying to figure out what on earth they were looking at when they pulled these fossils out of the ground. Because the story of Tanystropheus is not just a story about a weird animal, though it is certainly that. It is also a story about how science works, about how a creature can sit in a museum drawer for over 100 years and still manage to surprise everyone, and about what the Triassic world was doing in those strange, rebuilding millions of years after the worst catastrophe life on Earth had ever faced. Before we get into all of that though, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you right now? Are you in bed, lights off, phone resting on the pillow beside you? Are you on a long drive somewhere, the road dark and quiet ahead of you? Maybe you're doing something quiet at home, a late cup of tea, a window open, the night coming in. Whatever the answer is, I am glad you are here. And I'm curious what time it is where you are, because there is something fitting about listening to a story this old in the dark, when the world outside has gone quiet and your mind can actually settle into something. If you enjoy these kinds of quiet, long-form journeys through natural history and deep time, it genuinely helps if you click the like button and subscribe to the channel. It is a small thing, but it makes a real difference in getting these stories in front of more people who might want to hear them. And if you have a thought, a question, or just want to say where you're listening from tonight, the comments are always open and always read. Now, back to that shoreline. The first thing to understand about Tanystropheus is that it does not fit neatly into the mental categories most of us carry around for reptiles. We tend to picture reptiles as either snakes, which are all body, or lizards, which are compact and low and quick, or crocodilians, which are heavy and armoured and built for specific kinds of violence. Tanystropheus does not match any of those templates. It is something else. Something that seems to have arrived at its body plan by following a logic that is not immediately obvious. A logic that took paleontologists more than a century and a half to even begin to decode. The neck is the thing that stops you. It always is. When you first see a good reconstruction of this animal, whether it is a skeletal diagram or a detailed piece of paleo art, your brain does a small double take. It looks wrong. It looks like a mistake. Like someone accidentally stretched one part of the drawing and forgot to fix it before printing. The proportion is so extreme that it reads as an error rather than a feature. And yet it was a feature, a successful one. Tanystropheus existed for millions of years, which is more than can be said for most experiments in body plan design. In juveniles, the neck could reach around 1.5 meters, in adults closer to 3. Those numbers are worth sitting with for a moment. 3 meters of neck. If you have a reasonable sense of your own height, picture that length extending from your shoulders. That is what this animal was carrying around, attached to a body that was relatively modest in size, held up by short, sprawling legs, moving through a world of shallow warm water and low ferns at the edge of a Triassic lagoon. The strangeness of this is part of why it took so long for science to understand it. When the first fossils of Tanystropheus began turning up in Europe in the 19th century, the researchers who examined them were genuinely baffled, not in a polite academic way, in a real, fundamental way. The elongated bones that made up the neck were so unusual, so unlike anything in the known fossil record at the time, that some of the earliest interpretations got it badly wrong. Not slightly wrong. Completely, categorically wrong. Some researchers looked at those long, strut-like bones and concluded they must be the finger bones of a pterosaur, one of the flying reptiles that lived alongside the dinosaurs. The proportions seemed to fit, or at least they seemed to fit better than the alternative, which was admitting that you were looking at a neck vertebra from an animal that had no reasonable analogue in the living world. Others proposed different interpretations. Some thought the bones belonged to a flying animal of some kind, a glider perhaps, using those elongated structures as part of a wing membrane support. The bones were real. They were clearly reptilian, but the animal they came from remained for a long time genuinely unclear. Hermann von Meyer, a German paleontologist who had already made significant contributions to the study of Triassic fossils, formally named the genus Tanystropheus in 1852. The name itself comes from the Greek, meaning something roughly like elongated vertebra, which tells you what the most immediately striking feature of the fossil was to the people who named it. But even after it had a name, the animal's basic nature remained contested. Was it terrestrial, aquatic, some kind of semi-arboreal oddity? The reconstructions that followed over the next several decades were inconsistent in ways that, looking back, reflect less a failure of intelligence and more a genuine absence of the right evidence. The bones were telling a story, but not all the pages were there yet, and that is one of the things that makes Tanystropheus such a compelling subject. It is a creature that was discovered, named and studied for over 100 years before the people studying it could agree on something as basic as whether it lived primarily on land or in the water. That is not unusual in paleontology exactly, but the degree of uncertainty in this case was remarkable. The animal was strange enough that it kept resisting easy categorization, kept sliding out from under whatever interpretive framework researchers tried to apply to it. Part of the difficulty was the neck itself. If you found a fossil of a giraffe without knowing giraffes existed, you might struggle to explain why any animal would need a neck that long. You would understand, eventually, that it was a neck, but the ecological reason for it would not be immediately obvious from the bones alone. With Tanystropheus, the situation was even more extreme, because the neck was proportionally more dramatic than a giraffe's, and the animal it was attached to was clearly not a large terrestrial browser reaching up into trees. The teeth, the limb structure, the body proportions, the context of the fossils in marine sediment, all of it pointed somewhere, but the picture was blurry for a very long time. What we know now, and what we will spend this evening exploring, is that Tanystropheus was something quite specific. It was a hunter, a patient one, a specialist. And the neck, as bizarre as it looks, was not an accident of evolution or a developmental curiosity. It was a tool, shaped by millions of years of selection pressure in the warm, shallow lagoons of the Middle Triassic, refined into something that worked, that fed an animal, that kept a lineage going across an enormous span of time. The juvenile fossils alone, with their smaller necks reaching around 1.5 meters, give you a sense of how early this body plan established itself in the animal's development. This was not something that appeared late in life as a secondary sexual characteristic or a growth anomaly. The neck was there from early on, proportionally extreme even in young animals, which suggests that whatever it was for, it was essential from the beginning. And then there is the question of what, exactly, it was for. That question took a very long time to answer properly, and the answer, when it finally came into focus, came from an unexpected direction. Not from a new fossil site, not from a new species, but from a closer look at specimens that had already been sitting in collections for decades, using technology that Hermann von Meyer could not have imagined in 1852. But before we get to that, it helps to understand the world this animal came from, the specific place where most of what we know about it was preserved, and the long, complicated, sometimes frustrating history of trying to read those fossils clearly. Because the story of Tanystropheus is also the story of a mountain in Switzerland that was once the bottom of a tropical sea, and of the dark, layered shale that kept these animals waiting in the rock for 242 million years, patient as only stone can be, until someone came along with the right tools to finally understand what they were looking at. The mountain in question is called Monte San Giorgio, and if you visit it today, you would find a quiet, forested hill on the border between Switzerland and Italy, rising above the southern arm of Lake Lugano. There is a small village at its base called Meride, and in that village there is a museum, modest in size but genuinely excellent, dedicated entirely to the fossils that have been pulled from the rock of this mountain over the past century and a half. The mountain itself is peaceful, wooded paths, bird song, the kind of place that feels old in a comfortable way. You would not necessarily guess, standing there, that beneath your feet was one of the most important Triassic fossil sites in the world. But that is exactly what Monte San Giorgio is, and it is the reason we know as much as we do about Tanystropheus at all. The rock that makes Monte San Giorgio so remarkable is a dark, fine-grained bituminous shale laid down during the Middle Triassic Period, roughly 242 to 247 million years ago. At that time, this was not a mountain at all. It was the floor of a shallow, warm lagoon on the edge of the ancient Tethys Sea, a broad tropical ocean that once separated what we now call Laurasia in the north from Gondwana in the south. The lagoon was warm and relatively calm, partially enclosed, and its bottom waters were anoxic, meaning they were depleted of oxygen. That detail matters enormously. In normal marine environments, when an animal dies and sinks, scavengers move in quickly. Worms, crustaceans, fish, bacteria, all of them work to disassemble the carcass before it can fossilise properly. But in the low oxygen bottom waters of this ancient lagoon, most of those scavengers could not survive. When an animal sank to the bottom, it stayed largely intact. It settled into the fine sediment and was slowly buried, preserved with a fidelity that is almost unsettling when you see the results. The fossils that have come out of Monte San Giorgio are not just bones. They are in many cases complete articulated skeletons, still arranged in roughly the positions the animals occupied in life. Some specimens preserve outlines of soft tissue, the ghostly shadow of skin or muscle pressed into the shale. Some preserve stomach contents, actual physical evidence of the last meal an animal ate before it died. The shale itself is layered in thin, fine laminations, almost like the pages of a book, each layer representing a quiet, undisturbed settling of sediment. Reading those layers is one of the ways paleontologists reconstruct the conditions of the ancient environment, and what they tell us about this lagoon is that it was, at least in its deeper parts, a very still, very preserving kind of place. Excavation at Monte San Giorgio began seriously in the 1860s, though informal fossil collecting in the region predates that. Over the decades, Swiss and Italian paleontologists worked the site with increasing systematic rigour, and the list of species recovered is impressive. Mixosaurus, an early ichthyosaur with a body already streamlined for open water swimming, has been found there in beautiful condition. Sericosaurus, a nothosaur with elongated limbs suited for aquatic propulsion, has come from the same layers. Dozens of fish species, cephalopods, and smaller marine invertebrates fill out the picture of a busy, productive coastal ecosystem. The site became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2003, with the Swiss side designated first, followed by the Italian side in 2010. That designation reflects not just the quality of the fossils, but the scientific importance of the window they open onto a specific moment in the history of life, the early recovery of marine ecosystems after the catastrophic Permian-Triassic extinction. It was from this site that the most significant Tanystropheus material came. Hermann von Meyer, who formally named the genus in 1852, was working with fragmentary material, mostly isolated vertebrae and partial skeletal elements. The fossils that eventually allowed a more complete picture of the animal to emerge came from Monte San Giorgio and also from a handful of other sites, including locations in Germany and what is now Israel and the broader Middle East, which at the time of the Triassic would have been coastal margins of the same Tethys sea system. The distribution of Tanystropheus fossils across this region gives you a sense of how widely this animal, or animals closely related to it, were distributed along the ancient shoreline. But back to the confusion. Because even with multiple sites and multiple specimens, the picture remained murky for a remarkably long time. The core problem was the neck. Those elongated cervical vertebrae were simply unlike anything in the living world, and without a living analogue to anchor your interpretation, it is genuinely difficult to know what you're looking at. The early mistake about pterosaur finger bones is understandable when you consider that the strut-like proportions of the Tanystropheus vertebrae do superficially resemble the elongated metacarpal bones of a pterosaur wing. It takes careful anatomical analysis to distinguish them, and in the 19th century the tools and the comparative frameworks for that kind of analysis were still being developed. Paleontology as a formal discipline was young. The fossil record was full of gaps, and Tanystropheus, with its wholly unprecedented proportions, did not fit neatly into any existing category. What followed over the next 100 years or so was a slow, incremental, sometimes contradictory process of revision. As more complete specimens came to light, it became clear that Tanystropheus was a reptile, not a pterosaur, and that those elongated structures were indeed neck vertebrae. But the question of what kind of reptile and how it lived remained genuinely open. Reconstructions from the early to mid-20th century show the animal in a variety of postures and environments, some placing it on land with its neck stretched forward or upward, some placing it at the water's edge, and some attempting to show it as a fully aquatic creature. There was no consensus. The fossils were real and the anatomy was becoming clearer, but the behavioural and ecological interpretation was still essentially guesswork. Informed guesswork, but guesswork nonetheless. Part of the difficulty was that the Monte San Giorgio material, as beautifully preserved as it was, included specimens of very different sizes. Some Tanystropheus fossils from the site were quite small, representing animals only a fraction of the size of the largest specimens. For a long time, the assumption was straightforward and reasonable. The small ones were juveniles, and the large ones were adults. This is how it works for most animals, after all. You find a range of sizes in the fossil record of a species, and you interpret that range as representing different stages of growth. It seemed logical, it seemed parsimonious, and it was wrong. The error was not obvious because the bones of the small specimens and the bones of the large specimens were, in many respects, similar. The general body plan was consistent. The proportionally long neck was present in both. The sprawling limbs, the long tail, the overall body shape, these features did not immediately signal that you were looking at two different species. What did signal it, eventually, was the teeth. But the teeth of these small specimens were difficult to examine in detail because of the way the fossils were preserved and the limitations of the technology available to earlier researchers. The full significance of the dental differences would not become clear until much later, when a team of researchers applied a technology that Hermann von Meyer could not have imagined: high-resolution micro-CT scanning, which allowed them to peer inside fossil material without damaging it, revealing structures too small or too embedded to see any other way. That discovery came in 2020, and we will get to it in detail, but it is worth sitting with the earlier period for a moment, because there is something genuinely interesting about the century-long uncertainty surrounding Tanystropheus. It is easy, looking back, to see the confusion as a failure. 100 years of study and you still did not know if the animal lived on land or in water? But that framing is not quite fair. The researchers working on Tanystropheus during that period were doing careful, serious science with the tools and evidence available to them. The fossil record is not a complete document. It is a collection of fragments, preserved by accident, recovered by effort, and interpreted through frameworks that are always incomplete and always being revised. The fact that Tanystropheus resisted easy interpretation for so long is not a reflection of the quality of the science. It is a reflection of how genuinely strange this animal was, and how little in the modern world prepares you to understand it. There is also something worth noting about the geographic spread of the fossils. Monte San Giorgio is the richest site, but Tanystropheus material has been found in Germany, in the Alpine Triassic deposits of Central Europe, and in the Middle East, specifically in what is now Israel, where marine Triassic sediments preserve a similar coastal lagoon environment. The distribution suggests that Tanystropheus, or closely related members of its family, ranged widely along the Tethys coastline, occupying similar ecological roles in similar environments across a broad geographic area. That kind of distribution tells you something about how successful the body plan was. This was not a rare, isolated species clinging to a single habitat. It was widespread, persistent, and apparently well suited to the conditions of its world. The fossils from Monte San Giorgio were, for most of the 20th century, the primary material through which researchers tried to understand the animal. And those fossils, for all their quality, were still presenting puzzles that nobody had quite solved. The size variation remained unexplained in a satisfying way. The ecological interpretation remained contested, and the neck, always the neck, continued to resist the kind of clean, functional explanation that would make the whole picture click into place. Researchers knew what the neck was made of. They could describe the vertebrae in precise anatomical detail. They could count the 13 cervical vertebrae and measure the cervical ribs and note the way those ribs overlapped adjacent vertebrae to stiffen the structure. But knowing the anatomy of the neck and understanding why natural selection had produced it were two different things, and for a long time the gap between those two kinds of knowledge was wide. What the fossil record at Monte San Giorgio did provide, even in the absence of clear behavioural interpretation, was context. The surrounding fauna gave researchers a sense of what Tanystropheus was living alongside, what it might have been competing with, and what it might have been eating. Fish were abundant in the lagoon. Cephalopods were present. Smaller marine reptiles occupied various niches. The ecosystem was diverse and productive, recovering and expanding in the aftermath of the Permian extinction, filling with new forms of life that were still, in evolutionary terms, working out the rules of a remade world. Tanystropheus existed within that ecosystem as something specific, something specialized, something that had committed to a particular way of making a living in a particular kind of environment. The neck was part of that commitment. The teeth were part of it too, though their significance would not be properly understood for a very long time. The mountain kept its secrets patiently. The dark shale held the bones in their careful laminations, layer after layer, undisturbed. Researchers came with their tools and their questions, and they took away what they could, and they wrote papers that revised and contradicted and built upon each other across generations of scholarship. And the picture of Tanystropheus slowly sharpened, not all at once, not through a single dramatic discovery, but through the accumulation of evidence and the refinement of methods, until finally, in the early decades of the 21st century, the technology caught up to the question. And when it did, What it revealed was not just an answer to the mystery of the neck. It was something more surprising than that. It was evidence that the mystery had been more complicated than anyone had realised, because the creature at the centre of it had not been one creature at all. But to understand what that means and why it matters, it helps to first understand exactly what Tanystropheus looked like, in as much physical detail as the fossils allow. Because the body of this animal is strange in ways that go beyond the neck, and getting a clear picture of the whole creature is essential before any of the ecological or behavioural questions can make real sense. So let us start with the neck, because that is always where you have to start with Tanystropheus. Everything else about the animal makes more sense once you have spent some time with the neck. An adult Tanystropheus hydroids reach somewhere around 6 metres in total length. That is roughly the length of a large pickup truck, or a bit longer than a standard parking space. It is a substantial animal, not enormous by the standards of some Triassic reptiles, but not small either. And of that 6 metres, something close to 3 metres, roughly half the entire body, was neck. Just neck. Not head, not torso, not tail. Neck. That proportion is genuinely hard to hold in your mind without a visual reference. Think of it this way. If you stretched a 6-metre rope across a room and then mark the midpoint, everything from that midpoint to one end would be the neck. The head, the body, the limbs and the tail together would occupy the other half. The neck alone was as long as the rest of the animal combined, and this was not a soft, flexible, snaking neck like you might imagine. It was rigid, stiff, more like a long pole than a hose. The reason for that stiffness comes down to the vertebrae and the structures attached to them. The neck of Tanystropheus contained 13 cervical vertebrae. 13. That number is worth pausing on for a moment because it seems impossibly low for a neck that long. A giraffe, which has the longest neck of any living animal, has 7 cervical vertebrae, the same number as almost every other mammal, including you. 13 is not dramatically more than 7. But in Tanystropheus, each of those 13 vertebrae was individually very long, elongated far beyond what you would expect, and each one carried a set of additional bony structures called cervical ribs. Cervical ribs are not unusual in reptiles. Many reptiles have them. But in Tanystropheus they were extreme. Each cervical rib was long enough to extend past the end of its own vertebra and overlap the ones behind it, sometimes spanning 2 or 3 vertebrae at once. Imagine a set of long, thin rods, each one running alongside the vertebral column and braced against multiple vertebrae in sequence. The effect was something like an internal scaffolding system, a series of interlocking struts that ran the length of the neck and locked the whole structure into a relatively rigid configuration. The neck could move laterally, swinging side to side with some freedom. But vertical movement, the ability to raise or lower the neck significantly, was limited. This was not a neck designed for reaching up into trees or craning toward the sky. It was built for sweeping movements in a horizontal plane, close to the surface of the water or just below it. The skull sitting at the end of that neck was, by comparison, quite small, triangular in profile with a relatively narrow snout. In adult Tanystropheus hydroides, the teeth were conical and simple, pointed, robust, good for gripping and holding rather than slicing or crushing. There were gaps between some of the teeth that may have allowed water to drain away quickly when the mouth snapped shut around prey, a feature seen in some modern fish-eating reptiles and birds. The eye sockets were reasonably large. The overall impression of the skull is of something functional and compact, built for a specific purpose, without a lot of excess structure. Below the neck, the body was muscular and relatively short. Compact is probably the right word. The torso was not elongated. The length of the animal was concentrated in the neck and the tail, with the core body sitting between them like the body of a comma. The limbs were short and sprawling in posture, extending out to the sides rather than directly beneath the body in the way that mammal limbs do. This is a typical reptilian limb arrangement, and it tells you something about how the animal moved. On land, a sprawling posture is functional, but not efficient for sustained fast movement. In water, it matters less, because the body is supported by buoyancy, and the limbs can act as paddles or stabilizers rather than weight-bearing columns. The tail was long, not as dramatically long as the neck, but substantial, and in aquatic reptiles a long tail is often associated with swimming. It can generate propulsive force by sweeping side to side through the water, much the way a crocodile's tail works. Whether Tanystropheus used its tail primarily for swimming or for balance on land or for both is part of the broader debate about its lifestyle, which we will come to. But the tail's length and structure are consistent with an animal that spent meaningful time in the water. Putting all of this together into a single mental image takes some effort. The body is compact, muscular, low to the ground on short, sprawling limbs. The tail extends behind it, long and tapered. And from the front of that body, the neck extends forward, rigidly, horizontally for 3 meters, before ending in the small triangular skull. The overall silhouette is genuinely unlike almost anything alive today. People sometimes compare it to a snake attached to a lizard, or to a garden hose someone has stuck onto a small crocodilian. Neither comparison quite works, but they gesture at the right kind of strangeness. The proportions are simply not something your brain has a ready template for. There is one more structural feature worth mentioning, because it comes up in discussions of how the animal actually functioned. The shoulder and hip girdles, the bony structures through which the limbs attach to the body, were reasonably robust. Not enormous, but not reduced to the point of suggesting the limbs were vestigial or non-functional. This is relevant because it means the animal was probably capable of some degree of terrestrial movement, at least in the way that a modern crocodile can move on land. Slowly, deliberately, with the body low to the ground. Not agile, not fast, but capable. Whether Tanystropheus actually spent significant time on land remains a question, but the skeletal evidence does not rule it out entirely. What the skeletal evidence does suggest fairly clearly is that the neck was not designed for terrestrial use in any conventional sense. On land, that 3-meter neck would have been a significant mechanical challenge. Holding it elevated would have required enormous muscular effort. Carrying it low, dragging it along the ground, seems unlikely and would have been counterproductive. The most plausible terrestrial posture would have been something like a crocodile's. Body low, neck extended forward and roughly parallel to the ground. But even then, the weight and length of the neck would have made movement awkward and energetically costly. In water, all of that changes. The water bears the weight of the neck, and the stiff horizontal structure becomes something different. A long, controlled extension that can be held in position without continuous muscular effort, ready to be deployed. This is one of the reasons the aquatic hypothesis for Tanystropheus gained so much traction over the course of the 20th century, even before the 2020 study confirmed it through isotope evidence. The neck simply makes more mechanical sense in water than on land. The stiffness that seems like a liability on land becomes a kind of precision instrument in water. A long, rigid arm that can be positioned and held, and then moved quickly in a lateral sweep when prey comes within range. There is something almost architectural about it when you think about it that way. The cervical ribs are not just stiffeners, they are load-bearing elements, distributing the mechanical forces along the length of the neck, rather than concentrating them at any single point. The 13 vertebrae, each elongated, each braced against its neighbours, form a structure that is resistant to bending under load. It is engineering, in the oldest and most literal sense of the word, a solution to a physical problem arrived at through millions of years of selection pressure rather than conscious design. What the neck was not built for is equally informative. It was not built for flexibility. It was not built for reaching into crevices or wrapping around prey. It was not built for vertical movement, for lifting the head high or plunging it deep. The range of motion was limited and specific. This tells you that whatever Tanystropheus was doing with its neck, it was doing one particular thing, or a narrow set of related things, rather than using the neck as a general-purpose tool. Specialization at this level usually means a very specific ecological role, a very particular way of making a living in a very particular kind of environment. And that is where the physical description of the body connects to the larger questions about behavior and habitat. Because once you understand the mechanics of the neck, what it could do, what it could not do, and what conditions it was best suited to, the picture of how Tanystropheus lived begins to take shape. Not completely, not with certainty, but in outline. The stiff horizontal reach, the conical gripping teeth, the compact muscular body, the long tail, the short sprawling limbs. These are the components of a specific ecological strategy, and that strategy, as the evidence increasingly suggests, was built around water. The exact nature of that relationship with water, how deep, how often, in what posture, hunting what prey in what way, is where the story gets more complex. And it is also where the discovery of two distinct species rather than one becomes so important, because the large adults with their conical teeth and their rigid necks and their isotopic signatures pointing to saltwater feeding were doing something very specific in that lagoon, and the smaller animals with their different teeth and their different proportions were doing something else entirely somewhere nearby. The same neck plan, or a version of it, serving two different lifestyles in two different ecological spaces. But before we get to what those lifestyles actually were and how researchers figured them out, it is worth spending a moment with the question that dominated Tanystropheus research for most of the 20th century. Not what the animal looked like, but where it actually lived, and why that question proved so difficult to answer for so long. The question of where Tanystropheus actually lived sounds like it should have a simple answer. You find an animal's fossils, you look at the sediment around them, you look at the bones, and you make a reasonable inference. That is how it works for most animals. But Tanystropheus resisted that process for an unusually long time, and the reasons it resisted are genuinely interesting, not just as a historical footnote, but as a window into how difficult it can be to reconstruct behavior from bones alone, especially when the animal in question has no real modern equivalent. The earliest reconstructions, produced in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, tended to place Tanystropheus on land. This was partly a default assumption. Land animals were more familiar, more intuitively legible, and the idea of a large reptile living on a shoreline or in a forest was easier to picture than something more aquatic. Some of these early illustrations showed it moving through low vegetation, neck extended forward, perhaps reaching into shallow water to drink or to snatch fish from the surface. The images varied considerably. Some artists gave it a posture closer to a lizard, body low and sprawling. Others drew it more upright, neck arching gracefully. None of these reconstructions were based on particularly rigorous biomechanical analysis. They were, in many ways, educated guesses dressed up as scientific illustrations. As the 20th century progressed and more fossils came to light, the debate became more formal and more technical. Researchers began asking harder questions. Could the neck actually be held up on land? What would the muscular demands of that posture be? What does the limb structure tell us about locomotion? And crucially, what does the environment where the fossils were found actually tell us about where the animal lived? That last question points directly to Monte San Giorgio and to the nature of the deposit itself. The fossils of Tanystropheus were found in dark, fine-grained shales, the kind of sediment that accumulates slowly in quiet, low-energy water. The layers at Monte San Giorgio represent the floor of a shallow subtropical lagoon, somewhere in the western Tethys Sea, roughly 242 million years ago. The water in this lagoon was stratified, meaning the upper layers were oxygenated and warm, while the deeper layers were anoxic, essentially oxygen-free. This stratification is what made the preservation so exceptional. When animals died and sank to the bottom, there were no scavengers waiting to pick the carcasses apart, because nothing could survive in the low-oxygen bottom water. The bodies settled into the fine sediment and were slowly buried, preserved in extraordinary detail. The company Tanystropheus kept in these sediments is informative. Surrounding its fossils were fish, many species of them, some of them quite large, along with cephalopods, marine reptiles like Nothosaurus and Ceratosaurus, and early ichthyosaurs. This is not the fossil assemblage of a dry upland forest or a riverside meadow. It is a marine community, a snapshot of life in and around a warm, shallow sea. The presence of Tanystropheus in this context strongly suggested a connection to water, but it did not by itself prove that the animal was aquatic. Terrestrial animals end up in marine sediments all the time. Rivers carry carcasses out to sea, animals drown and drift, shoreline creatures fall into the water and sink. So the depositional context was suggestive, but not conclusive. The limbs complicated matters further. Tanystropheus had 4 functional limbs with recognizable digits. They were short and sprawling, set wide on the body, but they were not reduced or vestigial in the way you see in fully aquatic reptiles that have committed entirely to a life in water. A fully aquatic Triassic reptile, something like an ichthyosaur, had limbs that had been reshaped into flippers over millions of years of evolution. The bones shortened, fused, multiplied, the overall structure becoming a paddle rather than a walking limb. Tanystropheus did not have that. Its limbs looked like limbs. They looked like they could, in principle, support the animal's weight on a solid surface. This gave ammunition to the terrestrial camp, or at least to those who argued for a semi-terrestrial lifestyle, an animal that came ashore to rest, to nest, perhaps to move between water bodies, but that did most of its feeding in or near the water. On the other side of the argument, researchers kept coming back to the neck. The neck was the central problem, mechanically speaking, for any terrestrial reconstruction. A 3-metre neck stiffened by overlapping cervical ribs is not something you want to be carrying around on land if you can avoid it. The weight alone is significant. The muscular effort required to hold it in any useful position, elevated, extended forward, held steady while the animal moves, would be considerable, and the range of motion, limited mostly to lateral sweeping rather than vertical adjustment, makes the neck less useful for the kinds of terrestrial behaviours you might imagine. Browsing on vegetation, reaching into burrows, scanning for predators. The neck of Tanystropheus was not built for versatility. It was built for one thing, and whatever that thing was, it worked best when the neck did not have to fight gravity. In water, as mentioned before, the buoyancy changes everything. The neck becomes nearly weightless, supported by the surrounding fluid, and the animal can hold it in position with relatively little effort. The lateral mobility, which is the neck's primary range of motion, becomes an asset, a long rigid sweep to the left or right, covering a wide arc of water in front of the animal without requiring the body to move at all. For an ambush predator waiting at the edge of a lagoon, this is a genuine advantage. You stay still, you let the prey come to you, and when the moment is right, you swing the neck in a fast, controlled arc, and the conical teeth close around something slippery and quick. But even this picture, which sounds fairly coherent when you lay it out like that, was contested for a long time, because there were details that did not fit neatly into the aquatic model either. The tail of Tanystropheus, for instance, was long and tapered, but it did not show the lateral compression, the flattening from side to side, that you typically see in reptiles that use their tails for propulsion in water. A crocodile's tail is laterally compressed, a powerful sculling organ. An ichthyosaur's tail was modified into a vertical fin. Tanystropheus had a long tail, yes, but its cross-section was more rounded, more like a terrestrial tail used for balance and counterweight than an aquatic tail used for swimming. This suggested that even if the animal spent time in water, it was not necessarily a strong swimmer. It was not cruising through open water. It was doing something else, lurking perhaps in very shallow water where swimming was less important than stillness. There was also the question of what the small specimens were doing. For most of the 20th century, small Tanystropheus fossils were assumed to be juveniles, young animals of the same species simply not yet grown to adult size. Juveniles of many species behave differently from adults, occupy different microhabitats, eat different prey. So the small fossils were often set aside as developmentally informative, but not directly relevant to questions about adult ecology. This turned out to be a significant oversight, though not one that anyone could have easily corrected without the technology that became available much later. The small specimens were hiding an important secret, and it was not one you could see with the naked eye. For decades then, the honest position in the scientific literature was something like, "We are not sure." Tanystropheus was probably associated with water in some way. The neck probably functioned best in an aquatic or semi-aquatic context. The limbs suggest some terrestrial capability. The tail does not suggest strong swimming. The fossils are found in marine sediment alongside marine animals. Put all of that together and you get an animal that was probably spending significant time in shallow water, near the shore, doing something specific with that extraordinary neck. But the exact nature of its lifestyle remained genuinely unclear. This uncertainty was not for lack of trying. Researchers published detailed biomechanical analyses of the neck, modelling the forces involved in different postures. They compared the limb proportions to modern semi-aquatic reptiles. They examined the skull and teeth carefully. They debated the tail morphology. The fossil record was rich enough to generate serious hypotheses, but not quite rich enough to definitively confirm any one of them. Tanystropheus sat in that uncomfortable scientific space where the evidence points in a general direction, but the specifics remain frustratingly out of reach. What made this especially interesting in retrospect is that the answer was hiding in the fossils the whole time, not in the large adult specimens that had been studied most carefully, but in the small ones, the ones that had been labelled as juveniles and largely passed over. The key was not in the bones of the neck or the shape of the tail or the proportions of the limbs. It was in the teeth, specifically in the microscopic structure of the teeth of small specimens, which turned out to be so different from the teeth of large adults that they could not possibly belong to the same species. But that discovery, and everything it changed, belongs to a slightly later part of the story. What matters here is the shape of the debate as it stood before 2020. A century and a half of careful, serious scientific work, and still no firm consensus on whether this animal was fundamentally a creature of land, water, or somewhere in between. The neck remained the central puzzle, the feature that every reconstruction had to account for and that no reconstruction had fully explained. It was too long for land, too stiff for the kind of aquatic locomotion seen in other marine reptiles, too specialised for any simple analogy with modern animals to quite work. In a way, the uncertainty itself tells you something important about Tanystropheus. It was not a transitional form caught halfway between two lifestyles. It was not an animal in the process of becoming something else. It was a fully realised, highly specialised creature that had arrived at a particular ecological solution and stayed there, apparently successfully, for a very long time. The difficulty in categorising it reflects the fact that it does not fit neatly into any category we have built from modern animals. It was doing something that nothing alive today does, in an environment that no longer exists, using a body plan that evolution has not revisited in the same form since the Triassic. The tools we normally use to understand fossil animals, comparison to living relatives, analogy with modern ecosystems, only get you so far with Tanystropheus. At some point you have to let the animal be what it was, genuinely strange, genuinely specific, and genuinely difficult to fully grasp, which is, in its own way, one of the more honest things you can say about a creature from 242 million years ago. And it is also what makes the 2020 discovery so striking, because it did not just answer one question, it reframed the entire picture, and it did so by looking at something so small that generations of researchers had simply not been able to see it. The teeth of the small specimens, examined under a micro-CT scanner, told a story that the bones of the large adults never could. And that story begins with the realization that there was not one Tanystropheus living in that ancient lagoon. There were two. The study that changed almost everything came out in August 2020, published in the journal Current Biology. The lead author was Stefan Speakman, a paleontologist then working at the University of Zurich, along with a team of colleagues from institutions across Europe. The paper's title was precise and technical in the way scientific papers tend to be, but what it described was, by any reasonable measure, a genuinely surprising result, the kind that makes you go back and look at a century and a half of prior research and realise that everyone had been asking the right questions but looking in slightly the wrong place. The central tool was micro-CT scanning. This is a technique borrowed from medical imaging, scaled down and refined for use on small, delicate fossil specimens. A micro-CT scanner works by passing X-rays through an object from many different angles, and then using software to reconstruct a three-dimensional image of the interior, not just the surface, but the internal structure, the density variations, the fine anatomical detail that you cannot see by looking at a fossil from the outside. For paleontology, it has been transformative. Fossils that were too fragile to prepare further, or embedded in rock that could not be safely removed, or simply too small to examine under a normal microscope, could suddenly be explored in 3 dimensions without touching them at all. Speakman and his team applied this technique to juvenile Tanystropheus specimens from Monte San Giorgio. These were small fossils, some of them quite fragmentary, which had been sitting in museum collections for decades. They had been examined before, of course. You do not ignore fossils from one of the most productive Triassic sites in the world. But previous examination had been limited to what you could see on the surface, and the surface of a small, partially prepared fossil does not always tell you very much. The micro-CT scans went deeper, and what they found inside those small specimens, specifically inside the teeth, was not what anyone expected. The teeth of the small specimens were complex, multi-cusped. Each tooth had multiple points, a more elaborate structure than you would find in a simple peg-like or conical tooth. In living animals, tooth complexity tends to correlate with diet. Simple conical teeth are good for seizing and holding slippery prey. Fish, squid, things that need to be grabbed quickly and swallowed whole. Complex multi-cusped teeth are better suited for processing smaller, harder, more varied prey. Insects, small invertebrates, things that require a bit more mechanical work before they go down. The teeth of the large adult Tanystropheus, by contrast, were simple and conical. Large, robust, slightly recurved, the kind of teeth you associate with a predator that catches things in water and does not bother chewing them. This difference between multi-cusped teeth in small specimens and simple conical teeth in large ones was not subtle, it was pronounced. And it was not the kind of change you would expect to see simply as a result of an animal growing up. Tooth shape does change as animals mature in many species, but those changes follow recognizable developmental patterns. What the scans showed in Tanystropheus was not a developmental gradient. It was a categorical difference. The teeth of the small specimens were not immature versions of the teeth of the large adults. They were fundamentally differently shaped, suited for a fundamentally different diet, indicating a fundamentally different ecological lifestyle. The implication was clear, and the team stated it directly. The small specimens were not juveniles of Tanystropheus hydroides. They were a separate species, a distinct animal living in the same place at the same time but doing something different. The small species was given the name Tanystropheus longobardicus, a name that had actually been proposed before by earlier researchers who had noticed certain differences in the small specimens but had not been able to confirm species-level separation without the internal tooth data. The 2020 paper provided that confirmation, and with it, the entire taxonomic picture of the genus shifted. It is worth pausing on what this means in practical terms, because the implications spread outward in several directions at once. First, it means that for most of the 20th century, researchers studying the ecology and behaviour of Tanystropheus were unknowingly mixing data from 2 different animals. Measurements, proportions, behavioural inferences. Some of these were based on large adults of hydroids, some were based on small specimens of Longobardicus, and they were being analysed as if they all came from the same creature at different life stages. That is not an error anyone made carelessly. It was a reasonable assumption given what was visible, but it meant that the picture being assembled was always going to be slightly blurred, because it was a composite of two separate things. Second, and perhaps more interestingly, the separation of the two species allowed researchers to ask more specific questions about each one independently. Once you know that you are dealing with two ecologically distinct animals, you can go back to the evidence and ask what each one was actually doing. And for Tanystropheus hydroides, the large species, the one with the conical teeth and the extraordinary neck, the team had additional evidence beyond the teeth. They had isotope data. Isotope analysis of fossil material works by examining the ratios of different chemical variants of elements preserved in bone or tooth enamel. Oxygen isotopes, for example, can reflect the salinity of the water an animal drank or lived in. Carbon isotopes can reflect the food web an animal participated in. Strontium isotopes can indicate whether an animal spent time in freshwater versus marine environments. These chemical signatures get incorporated into hard tissues as an animal grows, and they can persist in fossils for hundreds of millions of years if preservation conditions are right. Monte San Giorgio, with its exceptional preservation, was well suited for this kind of analysis. The isotope data for the large Tanystropheus hydroides specimens was consistent with a marine lifestyle. The chemical signatures in the bone matched what you would expect from an animal feeding in salt water. A saltwater food web, saltwater hydration, saltwater environment. This was not definitive proof of full aquatic life, but it was strong evidence that the large adults were spending the majority of their time in or near the sea, eating marine prey, living in a marine context. The isotope data for the smaller Longobardicus specimens told a different story, one more consistent with a terrestrial or semi-terrestrial lifestyle, eating prey from a different part of the food web, possibly spending more time on land or in freshwater areas near the lagoon's edge. Two species, same genus, same location, same geological moment in time, but occupying completely separate ecological roles, eating different things, living in different microhabitats, apparently partitioning the available resources in a way that allowed both of them to coexist without directly competing. The technical term for this is niche partitioning, and it is a well-documented phenomenon in modern ecosystems. You see it in birds of prey that divide up a landscape by hunting at different heights or at different times of day. You see it in fish that share a reef but feed at different depths or on different prey types. You see it in insects, in mammals, in reptiles, coexisting relatives carving out their own specific slices of an ecosystem to avoid direct competition with each other. It is, in a sense, one of the fundamental organizing principles of ecological communities. Finding it in a 242 million year old reptile, documented through tooth morphology and isotope chemistry, applied to fossils that had been in museum drawers for decades, is the kind of result that reminds you how much information can be hidden in material that has already been collected and studied. The specimens were not new, the site was not new, the tools were new, or at least newly applied to these particular questions. And the answers they produced were substantial enough to require a significant rewrite of what Tanystropheus was understood to be. For Tanystropheus longobardicus, the smaller species, the picture that emerged was of a relatively modest-sized reptile, adults reaching perhaps 1.5 meters total length, which is not small exactly, but not the 6-meter giant of its larger relative. Its teeth suggest it was eating insects, small invertebrates, perhaps small lizards or other small vertebrates. Its body proportions, though still including an elongated neck, were less extreme than those of hydroids. It may have spent time in the vegetation near the lagoon's edge, or in the scrubby, semi-arid terrain that surrounded the ancient Tethys shoreline. It is a less dramatic animal than its larger relative, in the sense that a bird-eating hawk is less dramatic than a saltwater crocodile. But it occupied its niche just as specifically, and its existence fills in a part of the ecological picture that was previously blank. For Tanystropheus hydroides, the large species, the 2020 study essentially confirmed and sharpened what the best supported hypothesis had been suggesting for years. This was an aquatic animal, or at least a predominantly aquatic one, feeding on marine prey, spending its adult life in or very close to the water. The neck, the teeth, the tail morphology, the isotope data, all of it pointed in the same direction. The uncertainty that had characterized decades of research did not disappear entirely, but it narrowed considerably. The animal came into clearer focus. There is something quietly satisfying about that kind of scientific resolution, even if it arrives slowly and incompletely. The fossils had been there since the 1860s. The questions had been there almost as long, and it took micro-CT scanning of teeth, not the dramatic bones, not the famous elongated vertebrae, but the small, easily overlooked teeth of specimens assumed to be juveniles, to finally provide the kind of evidence that could move the field forward in a meaningful way. Science does not always work in grand revelations. Sometimes it works in very small details that turn out to have very large implications. It is also worth noting what the 2020 paper did not resolve. It did not settle every question about Tanystropheus. It did not explain exactly how the animal moved, or whether it came onto land at all as an adult, or how it reproduced, or what its metabolic rate was, or how it interacted with the other large predators sharing its lagoon. It separated the two species clearly and provided strong evidence for their distinct ecologies. But the full behavioural picture of Tanystropheus hydroides, the details of how it actually used that neck, how it hunted, how it rested, how it moved through the water, those questions remained open. The paper was a clarification, a significant one, but not a complete answer. It resolved the taxonomy and sharpened the ecological hypothesis without fully closing the behavioural questions. What it did do, perhaps most importantly, is give researchers a cleaner foundation to work from. Once you know that you're dealing with a fully aquatic, marine-feeding large species and a smaller, more terrestrial or semi-terrestrial species, you can direct future research more precisely. You can look at the large adult specimens specifically for evidence of aquatic adaptations. You can look at the small specimens for evidence of terrestrial locomotion. You can ask different questions of each animal, because you know they are different animals. That is not a small thing. Decades of research had been hampered, at least in part, by the assumption that small and large specimens belong to the same developmental series. Removing that assumption opened up the analysis considerably. The 2020 study also drew attention to a broader point about how fossil animals are classified and how easily reasonable assumptions can lead research in a slightly wrong direction for a long time. The assumption that small specimens were juveniles was not unreasonable. In many fossil species, juveniles are found alongside adults, and they look like smaller versions of the same animal. The problem with Tanystropheus was that the differences between the two species were internal, in the tooth structure, not in the gross anatomy, and internal features are simply not visible without the right technology. There was no way to see what the micro-CT scans revealed without micro-CT scanning. The error, such as it was a product of technological limitation rather than analytical failure, which is, again, a fairly common situation in paleontology. The fossil record is always being reinterpreted as new tools become available, and Tanystropheus is a particularly clear example of that process. For anyone who had been following Tanystropheus research over the years, the 2020 paper must have felt like a long overdue answer arriving in an unexpected form. The neck had always been the focus, the extraordinary, impossible-seeming neck, the feature that defined the animal and drove every ecological debate. And the answer came not from the neck at all, but from the teeth. From tiny, carefully preserved, microscopically complex structures in specimens that most people had assumed were just young animals waiting to grow up. There is something almost poetic about that, in a quiet way. The biggest question about this animal, answered not by its most dramatic feature, but by its smallest and most overlooked ones. And once you understand that the large Tanystropheus hydroides was a dedicated aquatic predator, isotopically confirmed, dentally confirmed, ecologically situated in a marine lagoon environment, the next question becomes obvious. Not what it was, but how it hunted. How exactly did an animal with a neck that long, that stiff, that structurally unusual, actually catch prey in the water? What did it do specifically when a fish swam past? The neck that had puzzled everyone for so long was not just a taxonomic curiosity, it was a functional tool shaped by evolution for a specific purpose. And understanding that purpose means thinking carefully about the mechanics of how this animal actually moved through its world, or rather how it stayed very, very still in it. So let us stay with the two species for a moment longer, because the ecological implications of what the 2020 study revealed go somewhat deeper than the headline suggested at the time. Finding two species where researchers had assumed one is interesting on its own, but the specific nature of those two species, the way they were different, and the way those differences mapped onto completely separate ways of living, is what makes the discovery genuinely significant beyond the taxonomic bookkeeping. Tanystropheus hydroides, the large form, carried isotopic signatures in its bones consistent with a marine diet. Isotope geochemistry works by measuring the ratios of certain stable isotopes, particularly carbon and nitrogen, and in some cases oxygen, preserved in fossil bone and tooth enamel. Different environments leave different chemical fingerprints in the tissues of the animals living within them. Saltwater environments have a distinct isotopic profile compared to freshwater or terrestrial ones. The food chains within those environments also differ isotopically, and those differences accumulate in the bodies of the animals eating within them. When the researchers analysed the large Tanystropheus hydroides specimens, the isotopic ratios they found were consistent with an animal feeding in a marine, saltwater environment, the kind of shallow lagoon represented by the Monte San Giorgio deposits. This was not speculative. It was a direct chemical record left in the fossil material itself, readable across 242 million years. The bones were, in a very literal sense, still carrying information about what this animal ate and where it lived. Tanystropheus longobardicus, the smaller species, told a different story. Its isotopic data did not match the marine signal of the large form. Combined with its complex multicusped teeth shaped for processing insects, small lizards, and invertebrates rather than gripping slippery fish, the picture that emerged was of an animal living in a more terrestrial or semi-terrestrial setting. Not deep in a forest somewhere, probably. The Monte San Giorgio environment was a coastal lagoon system, and the smaller species likely occupied the margins, the shoreline, the low vegetation, the shallow edges where land and water met. It probably foraged in the kind of mixed coastal habitat that was abundant along the Tethys shoreline during the Middle Triassic, picking off small prey in the way that modern skinks or small agamid lizards do today. Two species, same geographic area, same geological moment in time, completely different teeth, completely different isotopic signatures, completely different ecological roles. The technical term for this is niche partitioning, and it is one of the more elegant solutions that evolution has found to the problem of competition. When two closely related species live in the same area, they risk competing directly for the same food, the same space, the same resources. Over time, natural selection tends to push them apart, favouring individuals in each species that specialise more and more in a slightly different niche, reducing the overlap and reducing the competition. The result, across many generations, is two species that look superficially similar but live very different lives. You can see this pattern playing out in modern ecosystems in dozens of ways. Different species of warblers in the same forest occupy different vertical layers of the canopy. Different species of cichlid fish in African lakes have evolved different tooth shapes to exploit different food sources in the same water body. Different species of heron along a riverbank will tend to favour different water depths and different prey sizes, minimising the time they spend competing directly with each other. What makes the Tanystropheus case striking is not that niche partitioning happened, it is an extremely common ecological process, but that it is documented so clearly and so early in the fossil record. 242 million years ago, in a Triassic lagoon on what is now the Swiss-Italian border, two closely related reptiles had already divided their environment between them with enough precision that we can still detect the difference in the chemistry of their bones. That is a remarkable thing to be able to say. The fossil record is, in most cases, a very incomplete and fragmentary window into ancient life. Behaviour rarely fossilizes. Ecology rarely fossilizes. But isotope chemistry can fossilize, preserved in the mineral structure of bone and enamel, and tooth morphology can fossilize with extraordinary fidelity. The 2020 study used both, and the result is one of the clearest pictures of ecological differentiation that has been documented in any Triassic reptile. It is also worth thinking about what this says about the evolutionary history of the Tanystrophiidae as a family. If Tanystropheus hydroides and Tanystropheus longobardicus were living side by side in the same environment, and had already diverged into such distinct ecological roles, that divergence must have begun some time earlier, before the point represented by the Monte San Giorgio fossils. The two species did not suddenly develop different teeth and different isotopic profiles at the same moment. The separation of their lineages and the ecological specialization that followed would have taken many generations. Which means the Tanystrophiidae as a family had already been diversifying ecologically for some time by the Middle Triassic. The group was not a single ecological type, it was a family with range, capable of producing both large aquatic predators and smaller terrestrial insectivores from the same basic body plan. That is a sign of evolutionary flexibility, not rigidity. There is a parallel here with other successful reptile families, both ancient and modern. The Varanidae, monitor lizards, range from the massive Komodo dragon, which takes prey as large as water buffalo, to small species barely longer than a human hand that eat insects and small invertebrates. The same basic body plan, scaled and modified, fills a wide range of ecological roles. The Tanystrophiidae seem to have operated on a similar principle, at least within the range documented at Monte San Giorgio. The long neck, the sprawling limbs, the basic reptilian body plan, these were the shared template. What varied was the size, the tooth structure, the metabolic demands, and the habitat. And those variations were enough to produce two animals living in the same place, but essentially not competing with each other at all. One of the subtler points raised by the 2020 study is what it implies about how we should interpret size variation in fossil species more generally. The assumption that small equals young and large equals adult is, as noted, a reasonable default in many situations. But Tanystropheus longobardicus was not growing into Tanystropheus hydroides. It was a fully distinct species that happened to be smaller, with fully distinct teeth and a fully distinct ecology. This size difference was not developmental, it was taxonomic. And this is a known problem in paleontology. Distinguishing juveniles from small adults, or distinguishing two similar species from two age classes of the same species, is genuinely difficult when you're working from incomplete fossil material. The teeth, in this case, were the key. But in specimens where teeth are not well preserved, or where the tooth morphology is less diagnostic, the same kind of misclassification could persist for much longer. The Tanystropheus case is partly a story about a specific animal and partly a cautionary tale about the limits of size-based assumptions in fossil taxonomy. The researchers who conducted the 2020 study, Stefan Speakman and colleagues, were careful to note that their conclusions, while well supported, depended on the quality of the fossil material available and the specific methods used. Micro-CT scanning is not a magic solution to every paleontological problem. It works well when the specimens are well preserved and when the features being examined are preserved in sufficient detail to be interpretable. At Monte San Giorgio, the preservation is exceptional by any standard, which is part of why the site has produced so many important discoveries over the decades. The dark, bituminous shales there are unusually good at capturing fine detail. But not every fossil site has that quality of preservation, and not every question about Tanystropheus can be answered by looking at the Monte San Giorgio material alone. Still, what the study achieved within those constraints was substantial. It resolved a taxonomic confusion that had persisted for well over a century. It provided isotopic evidence for the ecological separation of the two species. It reframed the entire question of Tanystropheus ecology by establishing that the large aquatic form was a distinct species with a coherent and well-supported ecological identity, not simply the adult version of a more ambiguous generalist. And it did all of this using technology and methods that were not available to the researchers who spent decades puzzling over these fossils in the 20th century. Hermann von Meyer, who named the genus in 1852, was working with the bones alone, with no way to peer inside them, no way to analyse their chemistry, no way to examine the microscopic structure of the teeth in specimens the size of a human hand. The tools available to Speakman and his colleagues in 2020 would have seemed genuinely extraordinary to the scientists of Meyer's era, and yet the fossils they were examining were the same ones, or the same type of fossils from the same site, that researchers have been studying for 150 years. That continuity is one of the things that makes paleontology such an interesting field to follow over time. The specimens do not change. The rock does not change. What changes is the technology and the conceptual framework brought to bear on the material, and sometimes that is enough to completely transform what the material is understood to mean. Tanystropheus did not become a different animal in 2020. It had always been two animals. The fossils had always contained the evidence. It just took a particular combination of tools, questions, and preserved material to make that evidence visible. There is also something worth noting about the collaborative nature of the 2020 work. The study drew on specimens held in multiple museum collections, on expertise in isotope geochemistry, on micro-CT facilities, on phylogenetic analysis, and on decades of prior work by other researchers who had described, measured, and debated the same fossils. Science rarely works as a single dramatic breakthrough by a lone genius. It works more like this, incrementally, collaboratively, building on what came before, occasionally arriving at a moment where the accumulated effort produces something that genuinely changes the picture. The 2020 paper was one of those moments, but it was built on a century and a half of prior observation, argument, and careful description. Every researcher who had published on Tanystropheus before 2020, even those whose conclusions turned out to be wrong, contributed something to the foundation that made the 2020 findings possible. And now, with the two species question settled, or at least settled well enough to work from, the ecological portrait of Tanystropheus hydroides becomes the central focus. You have a large reptile, perhaps 6 meters from snout to tail tip, spending most or all of its adult life in or near the water of a warm Triassic lagoon. You have conical teeth built for gripping, not chewing. You have a neck that is long, stiff, and capable of lateral movement but limited in vertical range. You have a body that is compact and muscular, with a long tail that may have provided propulsion in the water. You have isotopic evidence placing this animal firmly in a marine food chain. All of that points toward a very specific kind of predator. Not a pursuit hunter, not an open water swimmer, but something more patient and more precise. Something that waited. And how it waited, and how it struck, and what exactly that neck was doing during the hunt. That is where the story moves next. So let us think about what patience looks like in an animal that has no concept of patience. What it looks like is stillness. A body held motionless at the edge of something, the shallows, the murk, the boundary between open water and the soft sediment of the lagoon floor. And then, when the moment arrives, a movement so fast and so direct that the prey has almost no time to register it as a threat before it is already caught. That is the picture that emerges when you put together everything we know about Tanystropheus hydroides as a hunter. It is not a complete picture. Behaviour does not fossilise. Nobody was there. But the anatomy tells a story, and the story is internally consistent enough that researchers have felt confident proposing a specific hunting model, not as a certainty, but as the most reasonable interpretation of the physical evidence available. The key is the neck, and specifically what the neck could and could not do. A neck that is 3 meters long and reinforced by overlapping bony ribs running alongside each vertebra is not a neck built for sweeping, curving, exploratory movement. It is not built for grazing, or for reaching up into vegetation, or for the kind of slow, deliberate repositioning you see in a long-necked bird scanning a shoreline. The cervical ribs in Tanystropheus hydroides, those extra bony struts that stiffen the neck along its length, would have significantly restricted vertical movement. The neck could swing laterally, side to side, with reasonable freedom. But raising or lowering it in a large arc would have been difficult, possibly impractical. This is a neck that was built for horizontal reach, not vertical flexibility. That constraint, which initially sounds like a limitation, starts to look quite different when you think about where this animal was living. In a shallow lagoon, the prey, fish, cephalopods, small marine invertebrates, is not above you or below you in any dramatic sense. It is at roughly the same depth as you are, or passing through the water column at a level that a laterally mobile neck can reach without needing to arc dramatically up or down. If Tanystropheus hydroides was positioned at the water's edge, or partially submerged with its body resting on the bottom or against a rocky substrate, its neck could sweep through a wide horizontal arc covering a substantial area of water in front of and beside it. That is actually a significant hunting advantage. A 3-meter neck, even a stiff one, covers a lot of ground without the body needing to move at all, and the body not moving is important. This is the other half of the ambush model. Modern ambush predators share a common feature. They're very good at being invisible until the last possible moment. The pike, a freshwater fish, lies motionless among aquatic vegetation until prey swims within range, then accelerates in a burst of speed that lasts only a fraction of a second. The alligator snapping turtle sits on the bottom of a riverbed with its mouth open, waggling a pink worm-like appendage on its tongue, waiting for a fish to swim close enough to snap shut on. The saltwater crocodile holds its body almost completely still at the water's surface for hours, then lunges with explosive force when a suitable animal comes to drink. What these animals have in common is not speed in the conventional sense. It is the ability to minimize detectable movement until the strike, and then to close the distance to the prey faster than the prey can react. Tanystropheus hydroides fits this template reasonably well. A compact muscular body held still in shallow water or at the water's edge, with a long neck resting at or near the surface, would present a minimal visual profile to fish moving through the shallows. The neck, held flat and extended, might even be difficult to distinguish from a floating branch or a ridge of rock in murky water. And then, when a fish or cephalopod passed within range, the neck could be driven forward in a rapid lateral strike, not a flexible whipping motion, but a fast, rigid lunge, more like a spear being thrust than a rope being cracked. There is a physics argument for why a stiff neck might actually strike faster than a flexible one in this context. A flexible structure, when accelerated, loses energy to internal bending. The energy you put in goes partly into moving the neck and partly into deforming it along its length. A rigid structure transmits force more directly. Think of the difference between swinging a wet noodle at something and swinging a stick. The stick delivers more force at the point of contact because it does not absorb energy in its own flexion. The cervical ribs in Tanystropheus hydroides were not a design flaw or a structural compromise. They may have been precisely what made a 3-meter neck usable as a hunting instrument. A neck that's stiff, driven by the muscles of the shoulder and the base of the neck, could deliver the tip of the skull to a target very quickly, and the large conical teeth were shaped to grip and hold rather than to cut or chew. Once a fish was caught, it would be held, repositioned, and swallowed whole or in large pieces. The conical teeth deserve a moment of attention here, because they tell you something specific about how the prey was processed. Conical teeth, simple, pointed, slightly recurved in some specimens, are not teeth built for breaking down prey into smaller pieces. They are teeth built for one thing: preventing a slippery, struggling animal from escaping. Fish and cephalopods are both notoriously difficult to hold. Fish are covered in scales and mucus, and they thrash. Cephalopods, squid, nautiloids, ammonoids can contract their bodies rapidly and jet backward out of a grip. Conical teeth that curve slightly backward toward the throat create a trap. The harder the prey struggles to pull free, the more the teeth engage. This is a common tooth morphology in aquatic predators, seen in modern gharials, in some species of dolphin, and in various fish-eating seabirds. It is a functional solution to a specific problem, and Tanystropheus hydroides arrived at the same solution that many other lineages would arrive at independently across hundreds of millions of years of vertebrate evolution. The stomach contents of Triassic reptiles from Monte San Giorgio have not been found for Tanystropheus specifically, at least not in a form that is clearly attributable to it. But the broader prey community of the Monte San Giorgio lagoon is well documented. Fish were abundant. Multiple species of Triassic fish have been recovered from the same dark shales, including semionitids and other ray-finned fishes, some of them in excellent preservation. Cephalopods were present, including early nautiloids and ammonoids whose shells are found throughout the Triassic marine record. Small crustaceans and other invertebrates rounded out the community. For a predator built to ambush prey in shallow water, this was a well-stocked environment. The lagoon was not a barren place. It was warm, productive, and full of life, even if its low-oxygen bottom waters were inhospitable to most animals that died and sank into them, which is precisely why the preservation there is so extraordinary. One thing worth considering is where exactly in the water column Tanystropheus hydroides was positioned during a hunt. The isotopic evidence from the 2020 study supports a marine lifestyle, but it does not specify depth or behaviour in fine detail. A few possibilities have been discussed. One is that the animal was primarily a shoreline predator, body resting on a beach or a shallow rocky shelf, neck extending out over the water surface to strike at fish passing through the shallows. This would be consistent with the limb structure, which, while not built for efficient walking, could support the body in a semi-terrestrial position. Another possibility is that the animal was more fully aquatic, resting on the lagoon floor in shallow areas and using the neck to strike upward and laterally at prey swimming above it. The limited vertical mobility of the neck makes a purely upward strike somewhat awkward, but a strike that is primarily lateral with a slight upward component is not ruled out by the anatomy. A third possibility, and one that some researchers find appealing, is that Tanystropheus hydroides used the neck as a kind of periscope in reverse, keeping the body submerged and the neck at or just below the surface, with the head positioned to ambush prey from below. This is speculative, and it is worth saying so clearly. The anatomy is consistent with several different hunting positions, and without direct behavioural evidence, which we will never have, the honest answer is that we are reconstructing the most plausible scenario from indirect evidence, not describing something observed. What the anatomy rules out is active pursuit hunting in open water. Tanystropheus hydroides was not chasing fish down. It was waiting for them. There is something almost meditative about that image, if you allow yourself to sit with it for a moment. A 6-metre animal, largely motionless, its long neck trailing through warm, shallow water, waiting in the green-tinted light of a Triassic afternoon. Not thinking, in any meaningful sense, not planning, just present, in the way that an ambush predator is present, alert to movement, calibrated to strike, conserving energy until the moment when energy is suddenly everything. It is a very old strategy. It predates Tanystropheus by hundreds of millions of years, and it has persisted long after Tanystropheus disappeared from the fossil record. Patience, in the biological sense, is one of the most durable inventions life has ever produced. It is also worth noting that the ambush strategy, combined with the specific geometry of the neck, may have allowed Tanystropheus hydroides to hunt in areas that other predators avoided or could not efficiently exploit. The very shallow margins of a lagoon, water that is only half a metre or a metre deep, cluttered with rocks or submerged vegetation, too confined for a fast-swimming predator to manoeuvre effectively, would be ideal territory for an animal that did not need to chase anything. A nothosaur or an early ichthyosaur built for speed and open water pursuit would find the shallows awkward. Tanystropheus hydroides, with its compact body and its long horizontally mobile neck, could position itself in those marginal zones and fish them effectively. This is niche partitioning in a very practical sense, not just a theoretical ecological concept, but a physical reality of body plans and habitat geometry. The lagoon at Monte San Giorgio during the Middle Triassic was not a single uniform environment. It had open, deeper water toward its centre, transitional zones of moderate depth, and very shallow margins where the water met whatever passed for a shoreline in that subtropical world. Different animals occupied different parts of that gradient. Tanystropheus hydroides, based on everything the anatomy and the isotope data suggest, was a creature of the edges, the places where the water was shallow enough to rest in, shallow enough to strike through, and productive enough to sustain a large reptile on a diet of fish and cephalopods. It was, in a sense, a specialist of the margins. And specialists of the margins are interesting because they can be very successful for a very long time, as long as the margin exists. The lagoon environment of the Middle Triassic provided exactly the kind of stable, warm, shallow, prey-rich habitat that an ambush specialist with a 3-metre neck could thrive in. The question of what happened when that environment changed, when the margins shifted, when the competition intensified, when the Triassic world began its slow transformation into something different, is a question for later in the story. For now, the animal is still there at the water's edge, in the warm Triassic light, doing what it does. And the place where it did that, the specific geography, the specific geology, the specific conditions of preservation that allowed us to know any of this at all, is itself a story worth telling carefully. Because without Monte San Giorgio, and without the particular chemistry of its ancient lagoon floor, Tanystropheus hydroides might be little more than a name attached to a handful of confusing bones, and the hunting strategy we've just been tracing would remain entirely invisible to us. The place matters as much as the animal, in a way that is easy to underestimate until you look at it directly. So let us talk about Monte San Giorgio directly, because it deserves that. It is easy to treat a fossil site as a backdrop, a place where things were found, a detail to mention before moving on to the more dramatic parts of the story. But Monte San Giorgio is not a backdrop. It is the reason we have a story at all, and the more you understand about the place itself, the more remarkable it becomes that Tanystropheus hydroides is as well understood as it is. The mountain sits on the border between Switzerland and Italy, rising to about 1,000 metres above sea level, covered now in forest and quiet trails, with a small village called Meridae near its base. There is a museum there, the Museo dei Fossili del Monte San Giorgio, modest in size but genuinely excellent in content, the kind of museum where you can stand very close to specimens that represent some of the finest Triassic preservation anywhere on Earth. It is not a famous tourist destination in the way that some natural history museums are. It is a quiet place, a specialist place, which feels appropriate. The excavations at Monte San Giorgio began in the 1860s, which means paleontologists have been pulling fossils out of that mountain for roughly 160 years. That is a long time, and the site has not been exhausted. New material continues to emerge. The dark shale layers there, bituminous and fine-grained, are what geologists call a Lagerstätte, a German term used in paleontology for a deposit that preserves fossils in exceptional detail, far beyond what ordinary fossilization produces. The word translates roughly to storage place or resting place, and there is something quietly fitting about that. The mountain has been storing these animals for 240 million years, releasing them slowly, one excavation season at a time. What made the preservation so extraordinary goes back to the conditions of the ancient lagoon that once occupied this space. During the Middle Triassic, the area that is now Monte San Giorgio was not a mountain at all. It was the floor of a shallow subtropical lagoon connected to the Tethys Sea, warm, clear at the surface, stratified by temperature and salinity, with water that became progressively low in oxygen as you descended toward the bottom. This stratification is the key detail. In a well-mixed body of water, oxygen circulates throughout the water column, which means that when an animal dies and sinks, it is quickly found by scavengers and decomposers. Bones get scattered, soft tissue disappears rapidly. What you're left with, if anything, is fragmentary. But in a stratified lagoon with anoxic bottom water that contains little or no dissolved oxygen, the bottom is essentially a dead zone for most life. There are no worms burrowing through the sediment. There are no crabs or fish patrolling the floor looking for carrion. When an animal died in the waters above and sank to the bottom of this ancient lagoon, it arrived in a place where almost nothing was going to disturb it. It settled into the fine dark mud and the sediment slowly covered it, layer by layer, season by season, preserving not just the bones but sometimes the outline of the body, the contents of the stomach, and in a few exceptional cases traces of soft tissue that would normally vanish within days of death. This is why Monte San Giorgio can tell us what Tanystropheus hydroids ate. Stomach contents preserved in that anoxic mud have allowed researchers to identify fish remains and other prey items associated with related Triassic reptiles from the same site. It is also why the teeth of juvenile specimens were preserved in enough detail that the micro-CT scanning in the 2020 study could distinguish individual cusps and surface textures, features that are usually lost to time but not here. The chemistry of the site did the work of a laboratory, and it did it for 240 million years without being asked. The site became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2003, with the Swiss portion recognised first and the Italian side added in 2010. The UNESCO designation notes that Monte San Giorgio represents the best-known record of marine life from the Triassic period, and that is not an exaggeration made for promotional purposes. It is a straightforward assessment of what the site contains. Nowhere else on Earth is the Middle Triassic marine ecosystem documented in this kind of detail, across this many species, over this many decades of careful excavation. The animals found there alongside Tanystropheus give a sense of just how rich the community was. Mixosaurus, an early ichthyosaur, has been recovered in multiple specimens, some with soft tissue outlines preserved around the skeleton, showing the shape of the dorsal fin and the tail fluke, structures that would be completely invisible in a less exceptional site. Ceratosaurus, a nothosaur with long limbs and a deep tail, was a larger predator in the same lagoon, probably hunting in more open water than Tanystropheus. There are placodonts, reptiles with broad, flat teeth designed for crushing shellfish, and various smaller reptiles whose relationships to each other and to later groups are still being worked out. There are dozens of fish species, some of them preserved in such detail that individual scales can be counted and measured. There are cephalopods, crustaceans, and plant material washed in from nearby land. The lagoon was not a simple place. It was a layered, diverse, functioning ecosystem, and Monte San Giorgio has preserved a cross-section of it that is essentially unparalleled. What the excavations look like in practice is worth imagining for a moment. The shale at Monte San Giorgio splits along natural plains. It was laid down in thin layers, and those layers can be separated carefully like the pages of a very old book. Paleontologists work with chisels, brushes, and sometimes dental tools, splitting the rock along these planes and examining each surface for the dark outlines that indicate bone or soft tissue. It is slow work. A single significant specimen might take years to prepare properly, first in the field and then in a laboratory, where fine tools and sometimes acid preparation are used to expose the fossil without damaging it. The micro-CT scanning used in the 2020 study is a more recent addition to the toolkit. It allows researchers to look inside a specimen without physically removing the surrounding rock, which is particularly useful for small or delicate fossils, where mechanical preparation might destroy the very features you are trying to study. The mountain itself is forested and calm today. Walking through it, you would not immediately know what was beneath your feet. There are no dramatic outcrops of bone-bearing rock visible from the trail. The fossils are in the shale, and the shale is mostly buried under soil and vegetation. The excavation sites are modest in appearance, trenches and cleared areas, nothing that looks particularly spectacular from a distance. The drama is entirely in what comes out of the rock, not in the landscape itself. And there is something about that quietness that feels appropriate for a place that has been doing its work in silence for such an enormous stretch of time. One detail that is easy to overlook is how the geographic position of Monte San Giorgio shaped what was preserved there. The ancient lagoon was partially sheltered from the open Tethys Sea, which meant that the water inside it was calmer and more stratified than the open ocean. It also meant that the fauna preserved there was specifically the fauna of a shallow, semi-enclosed coastal environment, not the open sea, not the deep ocean, but the marginal zone. This is exactly the kind of environment that Tanystropheus hydroides appears to have preferred, which is part of why the site is so well suited to preserving it. The animal and the preservational environment were matched to each other in a way that feels almost deliberate, though of course it was not. It was simply the overlap of ecological preference and geological circumstance, and the result is that we have a remarkably complete picture of an animal that lived in a very specific kind of place. The Italian and Swiss sides of the mountain have been administered somewhat separately over the years, with excavations conducted by institutions on both sides of the border. The Natural History Museum of Milan has been involved in Italian-side excavations, while Swiss institutions, including the University of Zurich, have worked the Swiss side. The collaboration between these groups has been generally productive, and the 2020 study itself was an international effort, drawing on specimens and expertise from multiple countries. This is fairly typical of major paleontological research today. The fossils are in one place, the analytical equipment is in another, the expertise is distributed across institutions, and the result is a paper with a long author list and a set of findings that no single laboratory could have produced alone. It is also worth mentioning that Monte San Giorgio is not the only place Tanystropheus fossils have been found. Specimens or fragmentary material attributed to Tanystropheus or closely related forms have been recovered from Germany, from Israel, from the Middle East more broadly, and from other Triassic sites around the former Tethys margin. This distribution makes sense if Tanystropheus hydroides was a coastal lagoon specialist, and if similar coastal lagoon environments existed along the margins of the Tethys Sea from Europe to the Middle East, then a wide geographic distribution is exactly what you would expect. The animal was not unique to one small corner of the world. It was a successful species across a broad stretch of subtropical coastline. Monte San Giorgio simply happens to be where the preservation was good enough to tell us the full story. What Monte San Giorgio ultimately represents, beyond the specific fossils it has produced, is a window. That sounds like a cliché, and it is, but it is also the most accurate way to describe what a Lagostetta does. Most of the fossil record is fragmentary, isolated teeth, scattered bones, fragments of jaw that require enormous interpretive effort to place in context. A site like Monte San Giorgio gives you something rarer. A community preserved in enough detail to understand relationships, behaviours, ecologies, and evolutionary patterns that would otherwise be completely invisible. Without it, Tanystropheus would be a puzzle with most of the pieces missing. With it, the puzzle is still incomplete. It always is. But the outline is clear enough to work with, and the picture that is emerging is genuinely extraordinary. That picture includes not just the animal itself, but the world it lived in, the other creatures it shared its lagoon with, the chemistry of the water it hunted in, and the specific conditions that preserved its remains for us to find. All of that comes from the mountain, and the mountain, quiet and forested as it is today, is still giving. New excavation seasons continue to produce new material, and new analytical techniques continue to extract new information from specimens that have been sitting in museum drawers for decades, waiting for the right question and the right tool. The broader Triassic world that surrounded Monte San Giorgio, the wider context of the geological period, the ecological recovery that was still underway, the other lineages diversifying alongside Tanystropheus, is itself a story that helps explain why an animal with a neck like this could exist at all. The conditions that allowed Tanystropheus to evolve and persist were not random. They were the product of a specific moment in Earth's history, a moment defined by catastrophe, recovery, and the extraordinary burst of evolutionary experimentation that followed. To understand why Tanystropheus looks the way it does, you have to understand the world it was born into, a world that was in many ways still putting itself back together. That world, the one Tanystropheus was born into, was not the ancient stable world we sometimes imagine when we think of prehistoric Earth. It was a world in recovery, a world that had recently survived something close to total collapse. To understand what the Middle Triassic actually was, you have to go back a little further, back to the boundary that preceded it. Roughly 252 million years ago, at the end of the Permian period, Earth experienced the largest mass extinction in its history. Scientists sometimes call it the Great Dying, and the name is not an exaggeration. The current best estimates suggest that somewhere between 90 and 96% of all marine species were wiped out. On land, the losses were almost as severe. Around 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species disappeared. Entire ecosystems that had been stable for tens of millions of years simply ceased to exist. The cause was a massive volcanic event centered in what is now Siberia, where enormous outpourings of lava released enough carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide to destabilize the global climate, acidify the oceans, and deplete atmospheric oxygen to the point where large parts of the ocean became essentially dead zones. It was not a single sudden catastrophe in the way an asteroid impact is. It was prolonged, uneven, and in some ways more devastating for being slow. By the time the Middle Triassic arrived, roughly 10 million years after that boundary, the world was rebuilding. But 10 million years sounds like a long time, and in some ways it is. It is longer than the entire history of the genus Homo, and yet in geological terms and in ecological terms, 10 million years is not necessarily enough to fully restore a complex ecosystem. The early Triassic, the period immediately after the extinction, shows clear signs of ecological instability, low biodiversity, opportunistic species dominating, simplified food webs, and what paleontologists sometimes call a recovery fauna. The organisms that survive a catastrophe are not always the most sophisticated, just the most resilient. Recovery faunas tend to be dominated by generalists, by small, fast-reproducing animals, by organisms that can tolerate a wide range of conditions. The Middle Triassic, the period when Tanystropheus was alive, represents a later stage of that recovery, the point at which ecosystems were becoming genuinely complex again. New lineages were diversifying. Niches that had been empty since the extinction were being filled, sometimes by entirely new kinds of animals. This is the context in which Tanystropheus makes the most sense. The shallow coastal lagoons of the Tethys Sea were not ancient, stable habitats with long-established communities. They were relatively new ecosystems still being assembled, with ecological roles available that had not yet been claimed by specialists. An animal with an unusual body plan, a very long, stiff neck attached to a compact body, could establish itself in a niche that might have been too competitive to enter in a more ecologically mature world. The Tethys Sea itself deserves a moment. It was not the ocean we know today. The modern Atlantic, Pacific and Indian Oceans did not exist in their current forms during the Triassic. The continents were arranged differently. The supercontinent Pangaea was still largely intact, beginning only the earlier stages of its eventual breakup. The Tethys was a large, warm, roughly triangular ocean that opened to the east, nestled between the northern landmass of Laurasia and the southern landmass of Gondwana. Its western end was shallow and warm, bathed in tropical and subtropical sunlight, with extensive shallow water platforms and coastal lagoons. It was one of the most productive marine environments of its time, and it was precisely along its margins that so many of the remarkable Triassic marine reptiles evolved and diversified. Monte San Giorgio sat along the western Tethys margin. The warm, shallow, partially enclosed lagoons there were exactly the kind of environment that Triassic reptiles were moving into in large numbers. The reptiles diversifying into these environments during the Middle Triassic were a genuinely varied group. Nothosaurs were among the most common, long-necked, semi-aquatic predators that probably moved between land and water, somewhat like modern sea lions, though they were not related to them at all. Some nothosaurs were small, around a metre long, while others reached 4 or 5 metres. They were active swimmers, using their limbs and body to propel themselves through the water. Placodonts were another group sharing the same lagoon environments. Stocky, broad-bodied reptiles with flattened crushing teeth designed for breaking open shellfish and other hard-shelled prey. Some placodonts later evolved elaborate bony armour that made them look, superficially, a little like turtles, though again the resemblance was convergent rather than indicating any close relationship. Early ichthyosaurs were present too, already becoming more streamlined and fish-like than their earliest ancestors, though the highly derived dolphin-shaped ichthyosaurs of the later Jurassic were still in the future. On land and in the shallower margins, early archosaurs were beginning to diversify. Archosauria is the group that would eventually give rise to dinosaurs, pterosaurs and crocodilians, and by the Middle Triassic the early members of this group were already present and beginning to spread. The first dinosaurs would not appear until the late Triassic, perhaps 230 to 235 million years ago, but their precursors, animals like the small bipedal Lagopithecus and the slightly more familiar Marsuchus, were already moving through the terrestrial environments of the Triassic world. Pterosaurs, the flying reptiles, would not appear until slightly later either, but the lineage leading to them was already present in the form of small climbing or gliding archosauromorphs. Tanystropheus, it is worth being clear about, was not a dinosaur. It was not closely related to dinosaurs. It belonged to a separate branch of the reptile family tree, the Archosauromorpha, which is a broader grouping that includes the archosaurs and their closest relatives, but Tanystropheus sat outside the archosaur crown group entirely. Think of it as distant cousin rather than a close relative. The lineage that produced Tanystropheus branched off early in the Archosauromorph radiation, before the split that would eventually lead to dinosaurs on one side and crocodilians on the other. This is an important distinction, not just taxonomically, but ecologically. Tanystropheus was not part of the Archosaurian success story. It was a parallel experiment, running alongside the archosaurs, occupying a very different ecological role and following a very different evolutionary trajectory. The climate of the Middle Triassic was warm, significantly warmer than today in most regions, with no polar ice caps and sea surface temperatures in the Tethys that were probably quite high, perhaps 28 to 32 degrees Celsius in the warmest shallow water areas. The day was slightly shorter than it is now. Earth's rotation has been slowing very gradually over geological time, and 242 million years ago a day was probably around 22 to 23 hours rather than 24. This is a small difference, but it is a reminder that even the most basic parameters of the physical environment were not quite the same. The length of the year, in terms of days, was correspondingly slightly different. The moon was also a little closer to Earth, producing slightly stronger tides. These are small details, but they add up to a world that was subtly different from ours in ways that are easy to overlook. The oxygen content of the atmosphere in the Middle Triassic was somewhat lower than today, probably around 16% compared to the modern 21%. This would have had real consequences for large active animals, particularly on land, where the thinner air would have made sustained aerobic activity more demanding. In water, dissolved oxygen levels in well-mixed shallow lagoons would have been adequate for active aquatic predators, though the stratified bottom waters, The low oxygen zone that was so important for fossil preservation at Monte San Giorgio would have been largely uninhabitable for most animals. Tanystropheus, hunting in the shallows near the surface, would not have been directly affected by the deep anoxic zone, but the anoxic zone was what ensured that its remains, when it died, were preserved rather than consumed. Vegetation in the Middle Triassic was dominated by ferns, seed ferns, horsetails and early conifers. Flowering plants did not yet exist. They would not appear until the Cretaceous, roughly 125 million years in the future. The landscape around the Tethys margins was probably a mix of low coastal vegetation, open areas of bare rock and sediment, and slightly more forested zones further inland. There were no grasses, there were no broad-leafed flowering trees. The visual character of the landscape would have been quite alien to a modern observer, greener than a desert, but with a different texture and palette than any modern forest. The sounds would also have been different. No bird song, no frog calls in the way we know them today. Insects were present. The complex teeth of Tanystropheus longobardicus suggest insects were a significant food source for the smaller species. But the insect fauna was different from today's, without bees, butterflies, or many of the groups we associate with modern ecosystems. Into this world, Tanystropheus fit as a specialist. The large aquatic form, Tanystropheus hydroides, was positioned at the water's edge, exploiting a specific hunting strategy in a specific kind of environment. The smaller Tanystropheus longobardicus was working the terrestrial or semi-terrestrial margin, eating insects and small invertebrates in the vegetation and rock zones above the waterline. Together they occupied a range of ecological space along the shoreline, from the shallow water out to the land without directly competing with each other. This kind of ecological partitioning, different species of the same lineage dividing up the available resources, is one of the recurring patterns in evolutionary biology, and seeing it so clearly documented in an animal from 242 million years ago is one of the things that makes Tanystropheus genuinely interesting beyond its unusual appearance. It is also worth noting that Tanystropheus was not alone in having a long neck in the Triassic. The Triassic period seems to have been unusually productive of long-necked reptiles across multiple different lineages. Nothosaurs had elongated necks. Dinocephalosaurus, a Chinese Triassic reptile from roughly the same period, had an even more extreme neck than Tanystropheus and was fully aquatic. Eudomorphodon and other early pterosaurs had relatively long necks for their body size. This is a pattern that paleontologists have noticed, and one interpretation is that the shallow Tethys lagoon environments specifically rewarded a long neck strategy. The ability to extend rapidly toward prey without moving the whole body, to reach into crevices or strike at fish passing through the shallows, was apparently a useful trick in these environments. Useful enough that it evolved independently in multiple lineages at roughly the same time. Convergent evolution, different animals arriving at similar solutions to similar problems, is one of the clearest demonstrations that evolution is not random in its outcomes. The environment shapes the solutions, and similar environments tend to produce similar solutions even when the starting points are very different. Tanystropheus, then, was not an accident or an anomaly. It was a product of its time, shaped by the specific conditions of the Middle Triassic recovery, the specific character of the Tethys coastal environment, and the specific ecological pressures of a world still rebuilding after catastrophe. The neck that seems so improbable when you first encounter it was, in the context of its world, a reasonable answer to a real ecological question. The question was, how do you catch fast-moving prey in shallow water without expending enormous energy on active pursuit? The answer, arrived at by at least 2 or 3 different lineages in the Triassic, was you grow a very long neck, you hold still, and you let the prey come to you. Understanding that logic does not make the animal look any less strange, it still looks strange. But it shifts the strangeness from absurdity to elegance, which is a shift that happens fairly often when you spend time with paleontology. The more you understand about the conditions an animal lived in, the less arbitrary its body plan seems, and the more you start to see the shape of the ecological problem it was solving. Tanystropheus was solving a real problem, in a real world, with real constraints. The solution was unusual, but it worked, for a long time, across a wide stretch of subtropical coastline, in a world that was nothing like the one we live in, and yet was governed by exactly the same underlying rules. What happened to that world, and to Tanystropheus within it, is itself a story. The Middle Triassic gave way to the Late Triassic, and the conditions that had allowed animals like Tanystropheus to flourish began to change. The ecological pressures shifted, new competitors arrived. The lagoon ecosystems that had been so productive began to be disrupted by changes in sea level, climate, and the increasingly competitive marine fauna. And somewhere in that transition, the long-necked ambush specialist body plan that had been so successful began to disappear. To understand why Tanystropheus looked the way it did, it helps to understand where it sat in the broader story of reptile evolution, because this animal was not just an oddity floating in isolation. It had relatives, it had a lineage, and that lineage, when you trace it carefully, turns out to be one of the more interesting corners of the Triassic family tree. Tanystropheus belongs to a group called Tanystrophiidae. The name is not the most elegant in paleontology, but it does the job. This family includes several other Triassic reptiles, most of them sharing certain anatomical features, elongated necks, relatively small heads, and a general body plan that suggests a lifestyle spent close to water. The most familiar of the Tanystropheid relatives, at least to specialists, is a genus called Macrocnemus. If Tanystropheus is the dramatic neck-forward headline of the family, Macrocnemus is the quieter, more modest cousin. It was smaller, adults reaching perhaps 60 to 70 centimetres in total length, and its neck, while elongated compared to most reptiles, was not nearly as extreme. Macrocnemus was probably more terrestrial, more agile and more generalist in its diet. Fossils of Macrocnemus have been found at Monte San Giorgio alongside Tanystropheus, which means these two relatives were sharing the same environment, living out different versions of the same basic body plan in different ecological roles. That is a small but interesting detail. The same site, the same geological layers, the same ancient shoreline, two cousins doing different things with a shared inheritance. Then there is Dinocephalosaurus. This one deserves a moment of attention, because it is in some ways even more extreme than Tanystropheus, and it comes from the other side of the world. Dinocephalosaurus orientalis was found in Yunnan province in southern China, in Middle Triassic deposits of roughly the same age as the Monte San Giorgio material. Its neck was, if anything, more dramatically elongated than that of Tanystropheus hydroides, proportionally long even by Tanystropheid standards, and adapted for a fully aquatic lifestyle. Unlike Tanystropheus, which likely spent at least some time at the water's edge or in very shallow water, Dinocephalosaurus appears to have been a more committed swimmer, its limbs modified into paddle-like structures and its overall body form suggesting an animal that rarely, if ever, came onto land. The Chinese fossils are exceptional in their preservation, and in 2023 and 2024, researchers confirmed something remarkable about Dinocephalosaurus. It gave birth to live young. A specimen was found with embryos preserved inside the body cavity, arranged in a way that was consistent with viviparity, live birth, rather than egg-laying. This is significant because it tells us that at least some members of the Tanystropheid lineage had evolved a reproductive strategy more commonly associated with marine mammals or modern lizards than with the egg-laying reptiles most people picture when they think of this group. Whether Tanystropheus itself gave birth to live young or laid eggs is not yet known. The fossil record has not preserved that answer clearly. But the Dinocephalosaurus discovery opens the question in an interesting way. The broader group that contains Tanystrophidae is called Archosauromorpha. This is a large and important lineage in the history of vertebrate life. Archosauromorpha is the group that eventually gave rise to the archosaurs, the crown group that includes crocodilians on one branch and birds, along with all the non-avian dinosaurs and pterosaurs on the other. In other words, Archosauromorpha is the larger family that contains, among its many descendants, every dinosaur that ever lived, every pterosaur that ever flew, and every crocodile alive today. Tanystrophiidae branched off from this lineage early, before the Archosaur crown group had fully formed. This means Tanystropheus was not a dinosaur, was not closely related to dinosaurs in any direct sense, and was not on the evolutionary path that led to them. It was more like a distant cousin, sharing a common ancestor with the Archosaur lineage somewhere back in the early Triassic or possibly the late Permian, but then going its own way, developing its own body plan, its own ecological strategies, its own very particular solution to the problem of how to live in a Triassic coastal environment. This distinction matters because Tanystropheus is sometimes loosely grouped with dinosaurs in popular descriptions of Triassic life, and that grouping is misleading. The Middle Triassic was a period when the Archosauromorph lineage was diversifying rapidly, throwing out all kinds of experimental body plans, and many of those experiments were happening in parallel, different branches of the same broad lineage evolving in different directions at the same time. Tanystrophiidae was one of those branches. The branch that would eventually lead to dinosaurs was another. They coexisted for a while, sharing ecosystems, before the dinosaur lineage eventually came to dominate the terrestrial world in the late Triassic and Jurassic. Tanystropheus, meanwhile, was doing something else entirely, something water-adjacent and specialised, and, in its own way, quite successful. What is particularly interesting about the Tanystropheid body plan is that it appears to have evolved the long neck independently from other long-necked Triassic reptiles. The nothosaurs, which were also present in the Tethys region, and which also had elongated necks and semi-aquatic lifestyles, were not closely related to Tanystrophiidae. They belonged to a different part of the reptile family tree, within a group called Sauropterygia, which would eventually give rise to the plesiosaurs. So when you look at the Middle Triassic coastal environment and see multiple lineages of long-necked reptiles, tanystrophiids, nothosaurs and others, you're seeing convergent evolution in action. Different starting points, different anatomical details, different internal structures, but arriving at a broadly similar external solution. Long neck, small head, aquatic or semi-aquatic lifestyle, ambush or pursuit hunting in shallow water. The environment was producing the same answer from different directions. This is one of the things that makes the Triassic such a rich period for evolutionary biology. It was a time of genuine experimentation, in the sense that many of the ecological niches that had been cleared by the Permian extinction were still being filled, and the competition for those niches had not yet settled into the stable, well-defined patterns that characterize more mature ecosystems. In a more competitive, more established ecosystem, a body plan as specialized as Tanystropheus might never have gotten off the ground, or might have been outcompeted before it could establish itself. The Triassic gave it room. The open niches, the warm shallow lagoons, the abundant fish and cephalopod prey, the relative absence of faster and more agile marine predators in the early and middle part of the period, all of these conditions together created a window in which the long neck ambush strategy could work, and work well, for a very long time. The 13 cervical vertebrae that define the Tanystropheus neck are worth returning to here, because they are central to understanding where the animal sits in the family tree and why its body plan is unusual, even among its own relatives. Macrocnemus had elongated cervical vertebrae, but not nearly as elongated as those of Tanystropheus. Dinocephalosaurus had a longer neck in proportional terms, but achieved it through a greater number of vertebrae, not just through the elongation of each individual bone. Tanystropheus hydroides achieved its extraordinary neck length through a combination of having a relatively small number of vertebrae, 13, which is not many, each of which was individually very long. The longest of these vertebrae in adult specimens could be several times the length of the vertebrae you would find in the neck of a comparably sized modern reptile. and each of those vertebrae was reinforced with the overlapping cervical ribs that stiffened the whole structure, turning what might otherwise have been a flexible, snake-like neck into something much more rigid and rod-like. This rigidity is one of the features that distinguishes Tanystropheus from other long-necked animals in both the fossil record and the modern world. Giraffes have long necks, but those necks are flexible and mobile in multiple planes. Plesiosaurs, which would come later, had long necks built from many shorter vertebrae and appear to have had considerably more flexibility. Tanystropheus went in a different direction. Fewer bones, each one longer, the whole structure braced and stiffened. The result was a neck that could sweep from side to side with some freedom, but had limited ability to move up and down, and which probably could not be raised high above the body for any sustained period without significant muscular effort. This is part of why researchers have been fairly confident that Tanystropheus hydroides was primarily aquatic. The neck, held roughly horizontal and supported by water, makes good functional sense in that posture. Out of water, holding that neck horizontal would require sustained muscular effort, and raising it significantly above the body would be even more demanding. The water, in other words, was not just the hunting ground. It was also, in a sense, the structural support system that made the whole body plan viable. There are still open questions about exactly how Tanystropheus moved through water. Did it use its limbs to paddle, in the way a modern crocodile might move slowly through still water? Did it use lateral undulation of the tail and body the way many aquatic reptiles do? The limbs of Tanystropheus hydroides were not dramatically modified for swimming in the way that plesiosaur limbs were. They were not true flippers. They were short, sprawling, and relatively robust, which suggests they retained some terrestrial function, or at least were not fully committed to an aquatic role. The tail was long and probably muscular, which would have provided propulsion. The overall picture is of an animal that was comfortable in the water, probably a capable swimmer over short distances, but not a fast or highly manoeuvrable open water predator. It was built for patience and precision, not speed and pursuit. The question of whether Tanystropheus came onto land at all is one of the genuinely unresolved ones. The limb structure suggests it could have, at least in a limited way, perhaps hauling itself onto rocks or mudflats to rest, the way modern crocodilians do, or to lay eggs, if it did lay eggs. But it would not have been graceful on land. The neck, unsupported by water, would have been a significant mechanical burden. Most researchers working on Tanystropheus today lean toward a model in which the large species, Tanystropheus hydroides, spent the great majority of its time in or very near the water, venturing onto land rarely if at all. The smaller Tanystropheus longobardicus, with its different teeth and different isotopic signature, was probably more comfortable on land, spending time in the vegetation and rocky areas above the waterline in search of insects and small invertebrates. Two species, two lifestyles, two answers to the question of how to use the same basic body plan. Within the Tanystrophidae family, there is also a genus called Langobardosaurus, a small and more derived tanystrophide from the late Triassic of Italy, and Augusta burriania from Russia, and a few other fragmentary forms from various parts of the Tethys region. The family was not enormously diverse in terms of the number of genera. It was not like the dinosaurs, which would eventually diversify into hundreds of forms. But it was geographically widespread, with members found from Western Europe to China, suggesting that the Tanystrophid body plan was successful enough to spread across a significant portion of the Triassic world. The Tethys Sea, with its warm, shallow margins extending across what is now Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, provided the connectivity that allowed these animals to spread and diversify. What is striking, when you look at the full picture of Tanystrophoid evolution, is how consistent the basic body plan was across millions of years and thousands of kilometers. The long neck, the small head, the relatively compact body, the semi-aquatic or aquatic lifestyle. These features appear again and again across the family in different species, in different geographic locations, across a span of time that covers tens of millions of years. That consistency suggests that the body plan was genuinely well suited to the environments these animals occupied, and that there was relatively little pressure to change it fundamentally. Evolution tends to modify what works. If the long-neck ambush strategy in shallow Tethys lagoons was producing successful animals, there was no particular reason for the lineage to abandon it, and so it persisted, in various forms, across much of the Triassic. The persistence of the body plan also makes its eventual disappearance more interesting. A lineage that holds to a successful strategy for tens of millions of years across a wide geographic range is not a fragile or poorly adapted lineage. When it disappears, the disappearance is not a story of failure so much as a story of change. Change in the environment, change in the competitive landscape, change in the conditions that had made the strategy work in the first place. The Tanystrophidae did not vanish because they were bad at being Tanystrophidae. They vanished because the world around them changed in ways that their body plan could not adapt to quickly enough. What those changes were exactly, and how they played out across the Middle and Late Triassic, is a question that leads directly into the next part of this story. Because the disappearance of Tanystropheus from the fossil record is not a clean or simple ending. It is part of a broader pattern of ecological upheaval in the Triassic, a period that saw not one but several extinction pulses before the major end-Triassic event that would eventually clear the way for the age of dinosaurs. And understanding what happened to Tanystropheus means understanding something about what was happening to the Triassic world as a whole, the shifting seas, the changing competition, and the slow replacement of one set of ecological specialists by another. So let us stay with that disappearance for a moment, because it is worth sitting with before moving on. Tanystropheus hydroides, the large aquatic species, drops out of the fossil record somewhere around the late Middle Triassic to early Late Triassic boundary, roughly 235 to 230 million years ago. This smaller Tanystropheus longobardicus appears to have gone around the same time, or perhaps slightly earlier. The broader Tanystropheid family fades with them, and the specific ecological role they occupied, the long-necked, patient, shallow water ambush specialist, does not get filled again in quite the same way. Something ended. The question is what caused it, and the honest answer is that we do not have a single clean explanation. What we have is a set of plausible contributing factors, each of which probably played some part, and together they paint a picture of a world that was slowly becoming less hospitable to the kind of animal Tanystropheus was. The Middle Triassic was not a period of sudden catastrophe. It was not like the end Cretaceous with its bolide impact and global winter. The Triassic had a different character, a series of smaller disruptions, fluctuating sea levels, episodes of volcanic activity, shifts in ocean chemistry, and gradual changes in the biological communities that inhabited the shallow seas. The Tethys Sea, which had provided the warm, stratified lagoon environments that Tanystropheus depended on, was not a static place. Its margins shifted as the continents moved. Sea levels rose and fell. The shallow, low-oxygen basins that had preserved the Monte San Giorgio fauna so beautifully were a product of a specific set of conditions that did not necessarily persist unchanged across tens of millions of years. One of the factors that researchers point to is the changing nature of the marine ecosystem itself. The early and middle Triassic were a time of ecological recovery after the Permian extinction, and part of what made that recovery period distinctive was the relative openness of the ecological landscape. Niches were available, competition was reduced. A specialist animal with an unusual body plan could find a stable place in an ecosystem that was still filling in. But as the Triassic progressed, that landscape became more crowded. More predators, more competitors, more fully adapted marine reptiles that were faster, more maneuverable, and better suited to open water. The ichthyosaurs are perhaps the clearest example of what Tanystropheus was up against. Early ichthyosaurs from the lower and middle Triassic were relatively modest animals, still experimenting with form, still diversifying. But by the late Triassic, ichthyosaurs had produced some impressively large and capable predators. Shastosaurus, Shonisaurus and their relatives were fully oceanic, streamlined and highly efficient swimmers. They were not competing with Tanystropheus in the shallow lagoons directly, perhaps, but they represented the direction that marine reptile evolution was taking, toward greater speed, greater aquatic commitment, greater maneuverability. The ambush specialist low-mobility body plan of Tanystropheus hydroides was moving in a different direction, or rather, not moving at all. It had committed to a strategy that worked in a specific type of environment, and as that environment became rarer or more competitive, the strategy had less room to succeed. The nothosaurs are another piece of this picture. Nothosaurs were semi-aquatic reptiles with long bodies, relatively long necks, and forelimbs modified for swimming. They were active predators, capable of pursuing prey rather than waiting for it. In the Monte San Giorgio fauna, nothosaurs like Ceresiosaurus coexisted with Tanystropheus, and for a time the two groups seem to have occupied different enough niches to avoid direct competition. But as nothosaur diversity and abundance increased through the Middle Triassic, the competitive pressure on a slow, ambush-dependent specialist would have grown. An animal that relies entirely on prey coming to it is vulnerable in a way that an animal capable of active pursuit is not. If prey populations shift, or if prey become more cautious or more mobile, the ambush specialist suffers in a way that the active hunter does not. There is also the question of habitat availability. The specific conditions that produced the Monte San Giorgio fauna, shallow, warm, stratified lagoons with low oxygen bottoms, were not universal across the Tethys region, and they were not permanent. Sea level changes during the Middle and Late Triassic would have altered the distribution of these shallow coastal environments. If the lagoon habitats that Tanystropheus depended on became less extensive, or more fragmented, the populations of Tanystropheus would have become smaller and more isolated. Smaller, more isolated populations are more vulnerable to local extinction events, droughts, storms, disease, short-term prey collapses, from which they cannot recover because there is no surrounding population to replenish them. This kind of habitat fragmentation is a common driver of extinction in both the modern world and the fossil record, and it is a plausible part of the Tanystropheus story, even if it cannot be directly confirmed from the fossils we have. It is also worth noting that the Triassic itself was not a geologically quiet period. There were episodes of large igneous province volcanism. The Siberian traps had already done their damage at the end of the Permian, but the Triassic saw its own volcanic events, including activity associated with the breakup of Pangaea. Volcanic episodes can alter ocean chemistry, affect sea surface temperatures, and disrupt the food webs that marine predators depend on. None of these events were necessarily large enough to cause a mass extinction on their own, but in combination with shifting habitats and increasing biological competition, they would have added stress to already vulnerable populations. What is perhaps most striking about the disappearance of Tanystropheus is not the disappearance itself, but what did not follow it. The long-necked ambush specialist niche in shallow marine environments was not immediately filled by something else. There is no direct ecological successor to Tanystropheus in the late Triassic marine fauna. The plesiosaurs, which would eventually become the dominant long-necked marine reptiles of the Mesozoic, were just beginning to diversify at the very end of the Triassic and into the early Jurassic. They would go on to occupy very different ecological roles: active swimmers, open water predators, with long necks that functioned quite differently from the rigid spear-like neck of Tanystropheus. The plesiosaur neck was more flexible, used differently in feeding, and associated with a fully aquatic, flipper-driven body plan. So there is not a clean line of ecological succession from Tanystropheus to plesiosaur. The niche, in some sense, simply ceased to be filled in the same way. This is actually one of the more interesting things about extinction in the Triassic. We tend to think of ecological niches as persistent things, as slots in the ecosystem that once emptied will eventually be refilled by something else, and often that is true over long enough timescales. But the refilling is not always immediate, and the replacement is not always a close functional analogue. The specific combination of features that defined Tanystropheus, the rigid long neck, the ambush strategy, the shallow lagoon habitat preference, the conical fish-catching teeth, did not reappear as a package in any later lineage. Evolution found other ways to exploit marine environments, but it did not revisit this particular solution. Dinocephalosaurus orientalis, the Chinese relative of Tanystropheus with an even longer neck, had already gone by this point as well, disappearing from the record around the same general period. Its extinction removed another branch of the long-necked Tanystrophid experiment from the world. Macrocnemus, the smaller, more terrestrial Tanystrophid relative, also fades from the record in the late Triassic. The whole family, across its geographic range and its ecological diversity, goes quiet at roughly the same time. That synchrony, different species, different habitats, different parts of the world, all disappearing within the same broad window, suggests that something larger than local habitat loss was involved. Whatever was changing in the middle to late Triassic world was changing broadly enough to affect the entire family. It is tempting, when thinking about an extinction like this, to frame it as a failure. But that framing does not really hold up when you look at the timescales involved. Tanystropheus hydroides, as a species, existed for something in the range of several million years. The Tanystrophid family as a whole persisted for perhaps 20 to 30 million years, spread across a wide geographic range, in multiple ecological configurations. By any reasonable measure, that is a successful lineage. Most species that have ever existed on Earth went extinct. The ones that lasted millions of years diversified into multiple ecological niches and spread across entire ocean basins are not failures. They are success stories that eventually ran out of road. The road, in this case, was the specific combination of Triassic lagoon environments, available prey, and reduced competition that had allowed the Tanystrophid body plan to flourish. There is something quietly thought-provoking about that. A body plan that seems bizarre to us, a neck that is longer than the rest of the body, a stiff and unwieldy structure that most modern engineers would dismiss as impractical, was not a mistake. It was a solution, a specific, carefully tuned solution to a specific ecological problem in a specific set of environments, at a specific time in Earth's history. It worked. It worked for a very long time, across a very wide area. The fact that it eventually stopped working does not diminish what it accomplished. It just means that the conditions that made it work eventually changed, as conditions always do. The End-Triassic extinction event, which came about 201 million years ago, some 30 million years after Tanystropheus had already disappeared, was a far more severe disruption. It wiped out the remaining nothosaurs, many of the early ichthyosaur lineages, and cleared the way for the Jurassic world that would be dominated by dinosaurs on land and plesiosaurs in the sea. By the time that event happened, Tanystropheus had been gone for tens of millions of years already. Its extinction was not part of that story. It was an earlier, quieter ending, part of the ongoing ecological reshuffling of the Middle and Late Triassic, rather than a catastrophic global event. What remains of Tanystropheus, then, is bones in dark shale, a handful of well-studied specimens from a mountain on the Swiss-Italian border, and a growing body of research that has, especially in the last decade, begun to give us a much clearer picture of what this animal actually was and how it actually lived. The disappearance is real, and the reasons for it are partially understood, but the disappearance is also, in a way, just the punctuation at the end of a very long sentence. The sentence itself, the story of what Tanystropheus was, how it lived, how it hunted, how it shared its world with other animals, is the more interesting part. And that story is still being written. Because the fossils are still being studied, the methods are still improving, and there are questions about Tanystropheus that the current evidence cannot yet answer. Questions about how it reproduced, how it grew, what its internal physiology was like, whether there were behavioural differences between individuals beyond what the teeth and isotopes already tell us. The extinction is not the end of the scientific story, it is just the end of the animal's time on Earth. The scientific story continues, and it continues in the laboratories and scanning facilities and museum collections, where researchers are still working to understand what exactly walked, or swam, through those warm Triassic shallows 242 million years ago. Which is where we turn next. The laboratories and scanning facilities and museum collections that keep this research alive are in many ways just as interesting as the fossils themselves. Because the way we study Tanystropheus today looks almost nothing like the way it was studied 50 years ago, or even 20 years ago. The tools have changed dramatically. And with them, so has the quality of the answers we are able to extract from bones that have been sitting in the ground for nearly 250 million years. The most important technological shift in recent Tanystropheus research has been micro-CT scanning. This is essentially the same principle as a medical CT scan, X-rays taken from many angles, combined by software into a three-dimensional image, but applied at much finer resolution, capable of resolving structures smaller than a millimetre. For paleontology, this is transformative. It means you can examine the internal structure of a fossil without cutting it open, without destroying anything, without even removing the specimen from its surrounding rock matrix if the density contrast is good enough. You can see the internal architecture of a bone, the growth rings inside a tooth, the tiny anatomical details that are invisible from the outside. The 2020 Speakman et al. Study, the one that separated Tanystropheus hydroides from Tanystropheus longobardicus, relied heavily on this technique. The juvenile specimens being examined were small, some of them just a few centimetres across, and the teeth were tiny. Under a regular light microscope, the teeth of the small specimens looked like simple pegs, not obviously different from what you might expect in a young animal of any species. But the CT scans revealed the internal cusp structure, the ridges and complexity that indicated these were not simple juvenile teeth at all. They were functionally specialised teeth, built for a different diet than the large adults. That distinction, invisible to the naked eye, was the key that unlocked the two-species hypothesis. Without the scanning technology, those fossils might still be filed away as juvenile Tanystropheus hydroides, and the ecological story they tell would remain hidden. Micro-CT scanning is now used routinely across paleontology, but it is worth pausing on just how much interpretive power it adds. You can look inside a femur and count the lines of arrested growth, bands in the bone that form during periods of slower development similar to tree rings, and from those lines estimate how old an individual animal was when it died, and how fast it was growing at different life stages. You can examine the internal structure of vertebrae to understand how they were loaded mechanically, which helps reconstruct posture and movement. You can look at the inner ear structure, the semicircular canals, which are sensitive indicators of how an animal moved through space. Animals that move quickly and need rapid balance corrections tend to have larger, more elaborate semicircular canals than slow-moving, stable animals. For aquatic animals, the canal proportions often differ from terrestrial relatives in predictable ways. These are the kinds of details that can help settle debates about lifestyle and ecology that the external skeleton alone cannot resolve. Isotope geochemistry is another tool that has changed what we can learn from Tanystropheus fossils. When an animal is alive, the chemical composition of its bones and teeth reflects the chemistry of what it ate and drank and where it lived. Different environments have different isotopic signatures. The ratio of oxygen 16 to oxygen 18, for example, varies between freshwater and saltwater environments and between different latitudes and climates. The ratio of strontium isotopes in bone can indicate whether an animal was living in a marine or terrestrial setting. Carbon isotopes can reflect diet. whether an animal was eating plants, insects, fish or other vertebrates, because the carbon that moves through food webs carries isotopic signatures from its original source. Analysing these ratios in well-preserved fossil material can give you a chemical fingerprint of an animal's ecological niche, independent of what the bones look like morphologically. For Tanystropheus hydroides, isotope analysis supported the conclusion that the large adults were living and feeding in a marine saltwater environment. The oxygen and strontium signatures in their bones were consistent with marine chemistry, not freshwater or terrestrial chemistry. This was important corroboration for the aquatic lifestyle hypothesis, because isotopes do not lie in the way that morphological interpretations sometimes can. Bones can be rearranged by currents, reinterpreted by researchers with different assumptions, misidentified as belonging to a different animal. But the chemical signature locked into the mineral structure of a tooth is hard to argue with, assuming the specimen has not been significantly altered by the fossilization process, which is always something researchers have to check and account for. Geometric morphometrics is a method that sounds more complicated than it is at its core. It involves placing a standardized set of landmarks on a bone or skull, specific anatomical points that can be identified consistently across specimens, and then using statistical methods to compare the overall shape defined by those landmarks across many individuals or species. This lets you ask quantitative questions about shape variation. Are the skulls of large Tanystropheus more different from small ones than you would expect just from growth? Do specimens from different geographic locations show consistent shape differences? Is there a pattern of variation that might indicate sexual dimorphism, different body forms between males and females of the same species? Sexual dimorphism is actually one of the open questions in Tanystropheus research. In many reptile species, males and females differ in size, in skull shape, in the robustness of certain bones, or in the presence of ornamentation like crests or spines. Whether Tanystropheus showed any of this is not yet clear. The sample sizes from Monte San Giorgio are not enormous. These are not animals that were preserved by the thousands. Each well-preserved specimen is a relatively rare and valuable find. With limited specimens, it is difficult to statistically distinguish between individual variation, sexual dimorphism, and age-related change. Geometric morphometrics can help, but only if you have enough specimens to work with. It is one of those questions that may only be answerable when more fossils come to light. The question of reproduction is similarly unresolved. Did Tanystropheus lay eggs or give live birth? This matters not just as a biological curiosity, but as an indicator of lifestyle. Fully aquatic reptiles often evolve live birth, because laying eggs requires coming ashore, which is difficult or impossible for animals that are highly adapted to water. Ichthyosaurs, for example, gave live birth, as we know from spectacularly preserved specimens showing embryos inside adults. Mosasaurs also gave live birth. Plesiosaurs likely did as well, based on at least one specimen with a fetal skeleton preserved inside an adult. Dinocephalosaurus orientalis, the Chinese relative of Tanystropheus, was recently confirmed to have given live birth, a remarkable finding announced in 2024. Given that Dinocephalosaurus was fully aquatic and closely related to Tanystropheus, it raises the question of whether Tanystropheus hydroides might also have reproduced this way. But so far, no Tanystropheus specimen has been found with embryos or eggs preserved in association with it. The question remains genuinely open. Metabolic rate is another area of active uncertainty. For a long time, all non-avian reptiles were assumed to be fully ectothermic, cold-blooded in the popular sense, meaning their body temperature and metabolic rate were determined by the environment rather than generated internally. We now know that the picture is more complicated. Some Triassic reptiles show bone growth patterns and vascular structures consistent with higher metabolic rates than modern lizards, suggesting that at least some degree of elevated metabolism may have been present in certain lineages earlier than previously thought. Bone histology, the microscopic study of bone tissue structure, can give clues about growth rates, and growth rates are related to metabolic rate. Fast-growing animals tend to have bones with more vascular channels and a more woven, disorganized structure. Slow-growing animals tend to have denser, more lamellar bone. Where Tanystropheus falls on this spectrum is not fully established. Some researchers have looked at the bone histology of Tanystropheid material and found evidence of moderately fast growth rates, which might suggest a somewhat elevated metabolism compared to fully ectothermic modern reptiles. But the data are not yet conclusive, and this is an area where more detailed study is needed. There is also the ongoing question of locomotion, specifically how Tanystropheus moved on land, if it moved on land at all. The large species, Tanystropheus hydroides, was almost certainly primarily aquatic, but the limbs were not so modified as to make terrestrial movement completely impossible. The question is whether it hauled out onto shores the way modern sea lions or seals do, or whether it was more committed to the water than that. The limb proportions and joint anatomy can give some indication, but reconstructing the full range of motion from fossil bones is inherently uncertain. Soft tissue, muscles, cartilage, tendons, does not preserve in most fossils, and it is the soft tissue that actually determines how a joint moves and how much force a limb can generate. Researchers use the shapes of muscle attachment scars on bones to estimate muscle size and orientation, but this is an estimation, not a measurement. The locomotion question is one where the honest answer is still, we are not entirely sure. What is interesting about all of these open questions is that they are not signs of failure in the science. They are signs of where the science currently stands, and they point directly to what future research will need to address. Paleontology is sometimes perceived from the outside as a discipline that simply digs things up and puts them in museums, as if the main work is extraction and display. But the interpretive work, the work of understanding what a fossil actually tells you about a living animal, is ongoing, iterative, and genuinely difficult. Every new specimen, every new analytical technique, every new comparative study of living animals adds something to the picture. The picture of Tanystropheus that we have today is dramatically sharper than it was in 2019, before the Speakman study. And the picture in 2035 may be sharper still, depending on what gets found and what methods become available. New specimens are still being found. Monte San Giorgio continues to be excavated, and the yields from that site have not been exhausted. Material from other Triassic sites, in Germany, in Israel, in the Middle East, in China, continues to be reassessed as new analytical tools make it possible to extract more information from existing collections. Museum drawers around Europe contain specimens that were collected decades ago, catalogued, and then not studied in depth, because the technology to study them properly did not yet exist. Some of those specimens may contain information relevant to Tanystropheus that has simply not been accessed yet. This is actually a common situation in paleontology. The backlog of unstudied or understudied material in museum collections is enormous, and new studies regularly come from researchers going back to old collections with new questions and new tools. The teeth, in particular, remain a focus of ongoing research. Teeth are among the most durable parts of any vertebrate skeleton. The enamel is extremely resistant to chemical alteration, which makes it good material for isotope analysis. Teeth also preserve fine structural details that can reveal diet, growth rate, and ecological niche in ways that other bones cannot. For a genus like Tanystropheus, where the tooth differences between species turned out to be so significant, detailed tooth analysis across a wider sample of specimens could yield further insights. Are there intermediate tooth forms that might suggest hybridization, or a more gradual ecological divergence between the two species? Are there individual specimens with unusual tooth morphology that might indicate population-level variation? These are questions that can be asked of the existing fossil record, given enough time and the right analytical approach. There is also the question of geographic variation. Tanystropheus fossils have been found not just at Monte San Giorgio, but at sites in Germany, in the Middle East, and in other Triassic deposits. Whether the animals from these different locations represent the same populations, the same species, or potentially additional undescribed species is not fully resolved. The specimens from outside Monte San Giorgio are often fragmentary, isolated vertebrae, partial skulls, a few limb bones, which makes detailed comparison difficult. But as methods improve, and as more researchers turn their attention to this material, the geographic picture may become clearer. It is possible that Tanystropheus had a wider ecological and morphological range than the Monte San Giorgio specimens alone suggest. What all of this adds up to is a research field that is genuinely active, genuinely productive, and genuinely unfinished. Tanystropheus is not a solved problem. It is a problem that has recently become much better defined, which is its own kind of scientific progress. Knowing what you do not know clearly enough to ask the right questions is often more valuable than having vague answers to vague questions. The 2020 study sharpened the questions considerably. It told us that there were 2 species, not one. It told us they had different diets and different ecological roles. It told us that the large species was aquatic, and the small species was probably not. Those are clear, specific findings that open up clear, specific follow-up questions. That is how science is supposed to work, and it is satisfying to see it working that way on an animal this strange and this old. The researchers who work on Tanystropheus are a relatively small community, as paleontological research communities go. No Speakman, who led the 2020 study, has continued to work on Tanystropheid material. Olivier Riepel at the Field Museum in Chicago has been involved in Tanystropheid research for decades. There are researchers in Zurich, in Milan, in various European natural history institutions who contribute to the ongoing work. The Monte San Giorgio fossils are split between Swiss and Italian institutions. The Natural History Museum of Milan holds significant collections, as does the Paleontological Institute and Museum of the University of Zurich. Collaboration between these institutions is essential, because the specimens are distributed across collections and no single institution holds all the relevant material. It is worth noting too that the museum in Meridi, the small village at the foot of Monte San Giorgio, has a collection of local Triassic fossils that is genuinely worth visiting if you ever find yourself in that part of Switzerland. It is a quiet place, not a grand natural history museum with towering skeletons and crowds. But it has the kind of specificity that larger museums sometimes lack. A deep focus on a single site, a single geological period, a single community of ancient animals. You can stand in a small room and look at the actual bones of animals that lived in a warm lagoon 242 million years ago, a few kilometres from where you're standing. There is something about that proximity, geographical and temporal at once, that is quietly remarkable. The science of understanding Tanystropheus is still moving forward, still accumulating detail, still refining its picture of an animal that spent millions of years in warm, shallow water and left behind just enough evidence for us to begin to understand it. The methods are better than they have ever been. The questions are clearer than they have ever been. And the animal itself, half neck, half body, fully improbable, turns out to be more interesting the more carefully you look at it. Which is, when you think about it, a fairly good description of what science does with the world in general. The closer you look, the more there is to see. And with Tanystropheus, there is still quite a lot left to look at. What that careful looking reveals, in the broadest sense, goes beyond the specifics of one genus of Triassic reptile. Because Tanystropheus is not just a strange animal from a distant past. It is a piece of evidence about something larger, about how life works, about the kinds of solutions evolution finds, and about what the Triassic world was actually like, in ways that still surprise us. That is where the story opens up next. There is a concept in evolutionary biology called convergent evolution, and it is one of those ideas that sounds simple until you really sit with it. The basic idea is that unrelated lineages, facing similar ecological pressures, sometimes arrive at similar solutions independently. Wings evolved separately in birds, bats, and insects. Eyes evolved separately in vertebrates and cephalopods. Streamlined body shapes evolved separately in fish, ichthyosaurs, and dolphins. The point is not that evolution is repetitive or unimaginative. The point is almost the opposite, that certain shapes, certain strategies, certain structural arrangements are so well suited to particular environments that life finds its way to them again and again through completely different paths, starting from completely different raw material. Tanystropheus is a piece of evidence for this. But it is a particularly interesting piece, because the solution it represents, an extremely long, stiffened neck used for ambush hunting in shallow water, is not one that persisted into the modern world. You cannot point to a living animal and say, there, that is what Tanystropheus was doing. The ecological niche it occupied and the body plan it used to occupy it are both gone. And yet during the Triassic, that body plan evolved not once but several times, in different lineages, in different parts of the world, apparently in response to similar environmental conditions. That pattern of convergence, appearing and then vanishing, tells us something about the Triassic that is worth pausing on. The Middle Triassic, the period when Tanystropheus was alive, was not just a time period. It was a particular kind of world, with a particular kind of ecological structure. The Permian Triassic extinction had cleared out enormous amounts of biological diversity, roughly 10 million years before Tanystropheus appeared. The seas were refilling. New lineages were radiating into empty niches at a pace that, geologically speaking, was quite rapid. And the shallow coastal lagoons of the Tethys Sea, warm, stratified, productive, full of fish and cephalopods, offered a specific set of opportunities for predators willing to exploit them. The ambush strategy, it seems, was one of the more successful ones available. Hold still, extend quickly, grip slippery prey with conical teeth. It is a simple formula, but it worked, and the long, stiff neck was the tool that made it work, at least for the lineages that found their way to it. Dinocephalosaurus orientalis, found in Yunnan province in southern China, had an even longer neck than Tanystropheus, proportionally one of the longest of any known reptile, and was fully aquatic. It belonged to a related but distinct lineage within the broader Archosauromorph group. Its teeth were different, its postcranial skeleton was different, its lifestyle was different in several ways, and yet the core structural solution, extreme neck elongation, was arrived at independently, in a different part of the Tethys world, in a different ecological context. The fact that two separate lineages living in different regions both extended the neck to such extraordinary lengths during the same geological period is not a coincidence. It is a signal about what that world rewarded. There is a related animal called Tanystropheus, found in late Triassic deposits in North America, which had a similarly elongated body plan and may have been semi-aquatic. A Macrocnemus, a smaller and more terrestrial tanystropheid from Monte San Giorgio itself, shows the family in a more modest form, still with a relatively long neck, but not to the same extreme degree. The Tanystrophiidae as a family seem to have been experimenting with neck length across a range of ecological contexts from the fully terrestrial to the fully aquatic, with the most extreme elongation appearing in the lineages that committed most fully to aquatic ambush hunting. That is a coherent evolutionary story, even if the details are still being filled in. What makes Tanystropheus specifically interesting, beyond its own biology, is what it reveals about the range of body plans that are physically possible and ecologically viable. There is a tendency, when we think about ancient life, to imagine that the animals of the past were somehow less refined, less optimized, less fully realized than modern animals, that they were experiments on the way to something better. This is not really how evolution works, and Tanystropheus is a useful corrective to that assumption. A 6-meter reptile with a 3-meter neck, hunting fish in a Triassic lagoon for millions of years, is not a failed experiment. It is a successful organism, The neck that looks absurd when you first encounter it, almost comically disproportionate, like something from a children's book drawn by someone who had never seen a real animal, was functional enough, well suited enough to its environment, to sustain a lineage across a span of time that dwarfs the entire history of our own genus by orders of magnitude. That is worth sitting with for a moment. Homo sapiens as a species is somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years old, depending on how you define the boundaries. Tanystropheus hydroides, as best we can tell, persisted for something on the order of 10 million years. The intuition that something so strange could not possibly work is simply wrong, and the fossil record is the proof. This connects to something broader about how we understand evolutionary success. We tend to judge ancient animals by whether their lineages survived, whether they gave rise to something that is still alive today. By that measure, Tanystropheus is a dead end. Its lineage is extinct. It did not give rise to anything we can point to in a modern ecosystem. But that framing is a little misleading, because it treats survival into the present as the only meaningful measure of success. Tanystropheus occupied its niche effectively for millions of years. It reproduced, it fed, it competed, it persisted through environmental changes that would have eliminated less well-adapted animals. The fact that it eventually disappeared, along with the specific ecosystem conditions that supported it, does not retroactively make it a failure. It makes it a chapter, a long, specific, well-developed chapter in the history of life on Earth. The Triassic was a period of what paleontologists sometimes call evolutionary experimentation, and that phrase is accurate but slightly misleading in its implications. Evolution does not experiment deliberately. There is no intention behind it, no designer trying out different models to see which one works. What actually happened is that the mass extinction left so many ecological niches empty that the random variation of evolution, filtered through natural selection, produced an unusually wide range of viable body plans in a relatively short geological time. Animals that would have been outcompeted in a more saturated ecosystem found room to establish themselves and persist. Long-necked ambush hunters, flat-bodied shellfish crushers, fast-swimming early ichthyosaurs. Each of these represents a solution to a particular ecological problem, arrived at without foresight, sustained by the simple fact that it worked well enough to keep the lineage going. Tanystropheus is one of the more visually striking examples of this diversification, which is part of why it captures attention when people encounter it for the first time. The proportions are so extreme that the animal seems to violate some unspoken rule about how bodies are supposed to be arranged. But the rule it seems to violate is really just our expectation, built from familiarity with modern animals, that necks should be shorter than bodies. That expectation is not a biological law. It is just a description of what most living animals happen to look like, which is itself the product of a particular set of evolutionary pressures that differ from the ones Tanystropheus faced. There is also something interesting in the history of how Tanystropheus has been depicted, how its image has changed as scientific understanding has changed. The early reconstructions from the 19th and early 20th centuries were often wildly inaccurate by modern standards. Some showed it as a terrestrial animal, standing upright on its limbs with its neck raised high like a miniature sauropod. Others showed it wading in shallow water with its body mostly submerged. Some of the older illustrations gave it a kind of generic reptile look, scaly, dull-coloured, vaguely lizard-like, that reflected the assumptions of the time more than any actual evidence. The idea that Triassic reptiles were dull-coloured and behaviourally simple has been revised considerably by modern paleontology, though we still have limited direct evidence for colour in most specimens. More recent reconstructions, informed by the 2020 findings and by better understanding of the animal's biomechanics and ecology, tend to show Tanystropheus hydroides in or near water, with its body low and its neck extended horizontally rather than raised. The neck is shown as stiff, not sinuous. The animal looks less like a fantasy creature and more like something that could actually function. A predator with a specific tool for a specific job. Some reconstructions have given it counter-shading, darker on top and lighter below, which is a common pattern in aquatic ambush predators and is plausible given the ecology, though not directly evidenced. The shift in depiction is itself a record of how the science has moved. From confusion to hypothesis to something closer to a coherent ecological portrait. Tanystropheus has appeared in a handful of documentaries over the years, most notably in the BBC's Sea Monsters from 2003, where it was shown as a shoreline predator. That depiction predates the 2020 study and reflects the older, less resolved understanding of the animal. It is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in ways that the 2020 research has since clarified. The documentary showed a single species, not two. It showed the animal in a plausible habitat, but without the specific ecological framing that the isotope data and tooth morphology have since provided. If a major documentary were made about Tanystropheus today, it would look rather different. Two species, distinct niches, one aquatic and one not. The neck as a precision ambush tool rather than a vague anatomical curiosity. That gap between the 2003 depiction and what we know now is only 20 years. 20 years of new methods, new specimens, new analytical approaches, and a single landmark study that restructured the whole picture. It is a reminder that popular depictions of prehistoric animals often lag behind the science, sometimes by decades. The Tanystropheus that most people have seen, if they have seen it at all, is probably not the Tanystropheus that current research describes. This is true of many prehistoric animals. The public image of Velociraptor, for instance, is still largely shaped by the featherless version from a 1993 film, despite the fact that the evidence for feathered dromaeosaurids has been solid for many years. Science moves faster than culture, and prehistoric animals tend to get frozen in the depiction that coincided with their moment of popular attention. For Tanystropheus, that moment of popular attention has not really arrived yet. It is known among people who follow paleontology closely, appreciated by those who have encountered it in museum collections or natural history writing, but it has not had its cultural moment in the way that some other prehistoric animals have. This is perhaps not surprising. It does not have the size of a sauropod or the drama of a large theropod. It lived in a period, the Triassic, that receives less popular attention than the Jurassic or Cretaceous. And its story, the real story, the one involving two species and isotope chemistry and micro-CT scans of tiny teeth, is a relatively recent development that has not yet filtered widely into popular awareness. But the real story is genuinely fascinating, and it rewards the kind of careful attention that the science has given it. An animal that was misidentified for over a century, a site that preserves it in extraordinary detail. A 2020 study that used technology unimaginable to the original 19th century researchers to reveal that what everyone thought was one species was actually two, living side by side, eating different things, occupying different ecological roles. A neck that seemed absurd until the ecology made sense of it. A body plan that evolved independently in multiple lineages during a specific geological window, then vanished completely. These are not minor footnotes. They are substantive pieces of a larger story about how life works, how evolution works, and how the history of the Earth is stranger and richer than any simple account of it can capture. There is also something worth saying about what Tanystropheus represents for the practice of paleontology itself. It is an example of how much information can be extracted from material that has been sitting in museum collections for well over a century. The fossils used in the 2020 study were not new discoveries pulled from fresh excavations. They were specimens that had been collected decades earlier, studied by previous researchers and classified, incorrectly as it turned out, as juveniles of a known species. The technology to look at them differently did not exist when they were first collected. The questions being asked of them were different. It took the combination of new tools, new methods, and researchers willing to go back and look again to reveal what those fossils actually contained. This happens regularly in paleontology, and it is one of the field's more underappreciated qualities. The fossil record is a fixed resource, in the sense that the fossils that exist are the fossils that exist. You cannot make more of them. But the information that can be extracted from existing specimens is not fixed. It grows as methods improve. Bones that told one story under a light microscope tell a different and richer story under a micro-CT scanner. Teeth that looked similar to the naked eye reveal structural and chemical differences when analysed with isotope mass spectrometry. The fossils do not change, the questions do, and so do the tools available to answer them. Tanystropheus is a beneficiary of this process, and its story is not finished. There are more specimens to be analysed, more questions to be asked, more methods to be applied. The two-species conclusion of the 2020 study is solid, but the details of how those two species interacted, how they reproduced, how they grew, how they navigated the same geographic space with different ecological roles, those details are still being worked out. And somewhere in the existing collections, or in the shale layers of Monte San Giorgio that have not yet been excavated, there may be specimens that change the picture again, not dramatically, perhaps, but in ways that matter. That is the nature of science as a process, and it is particularly visible in paleontology, where the evidence is fragmentary by definition, and every new specimen is a potential revision. The story of Tanystropheus is a story about an animal, yes, but it is also a story about how knowledge accumulates, slowly, unevenly, sometimes in sudden jumps when new tools or new specimens arrive, but always building toward a clearer picture of something that was real, that lived and fed and moved through a world we can barely imagine. And that process of building, that careful accumulation of understanding across decades and centuries of research, is itself something worth appreciating. Because it is what brings us to the edge of that Triassic lagoon 242 million years later, and lets us begin to see what is waiting there. So let us go back to that shoreline one more time. The water is warm, shallow, and very clear in the way that warm, shallow water often is. You can see the bottom, pale and sandy, with dark patches of weed and the occasional flash of something moving just below the surface. The light is low and amber, coming in at an angle across the lagoon. There is almost no sound except the water. The ferns along the edge are still. The air smells of brine and something faintly organic, the way coastal water always does. It is a quiet scene, peaceful even, and at the edge of the lagoon, where the water is perhaps 1/2 metre deep, something is completely motionless. You might not notice it at first. The body is low, compact, held close to the bottom. The tail drifts slightly with the current. And then, extending out from that body, running just below the surface of the water, is a neck that goes on for what seems like an unreasonable distance. 3 meters of stiffened, reinforced vertebrae, held at a shallow angle, barely disturbing the surface, the small triangular head resting almost still at the far end. It is not moving, it is waiting. And it has been waiting, in one form or another, for a very long time. That is the image that the science has slowly assembled for us. Not the confused reconstruction of the 19th century, not the vaguely gliding creature that some early researchers imagined, not even the generic aquatic reptile of mid-20th century natural history illustration. Something more specific than any of those. An ambush hunter, patient and precise, in a warm Triassic lagoon that no longer exists, in a world so different from ours that the continents were in different places and the days were slightly shorter. A real animal. A successful one by any reasonable measure. It persisted for millions of years, diversified into at least 2 ecologically distinct species, and left behind fossils detailed enough that we are still learning from them today. What strikes me about this, sitting with it quietly, is how long the gap was. Tanystropheus lived for a stretch of time that is genuinely difficult to hold in your head. Millions of years of feeding and moving and reproducing in that Triassic world, and then it was gone, and the world moved on, and the sediment covered the bones, and the shale layers built up over them, and the mountain that was once a lagoon floor rose slowly over geological time, and nothing knew those bones were there. Not for 242 million years. That is not a dramatic number. It is just a very, very large one. Long enough that the entire history of complex animal life on land fits comfortably inside it, with room to spare. And then, in the 1840s and 1850s, someone found the fossils. Hermann von Meyer looked at those elongated cervical vertebrae and gave the animal a name, even though he was not entirely sure what he was naming. The bones were real. The animal was real. But what it had actually been, how it lived, what it ate, whether it was one species or two, that remained genuinely unclear for most of the time since. Over a century of confusion, of competing reconstructions, of reasonable researchers looking at the same fossils and arriving at different conclusions. And then, in 2020, a team of researchers put small juvenile specimens under a micro-CT scanner, looked at the internal structure of teeth that are only a few millimeters across, and found the answer that had been sitting in those fossils all along, less than 5 years ago. The study that properly separated Tanystropheus, hydroides, from Tanystropheus longobardicus, that confirmed the aquatic lifestyle of the large species with isotopic evidence, that resolved a debate that had been running for well over 100 years. That study is less than 5 years old, which means that if you were paying attention to paleontology in 2019, your mental image of Tanystropheus was still the uncertain one, the one where the ecology was genuinely unresolved, where the two forms were still classified as the same species at different growth stages, where the best answer available was essentially a careful shrug. 1 year later, the picture changed substantially. That is how science actually works, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, not as a criticism of earlier researchers who were doing careful work with the tools and questions available to them, but as a reminder of how much can shift in a short time when the right method meets the right specimen. The fossils that made the 2020 study possible had been sitting in collections for decades. They were not new. They had been studied before. They had been classified, labelled, placed in drawers, and referenced in earlier literature. What changed was the technology available to look at them, and the specific question being asked of them. Micro-CT scanning, which allows researchers to see the internal structure of a fossil without cutting it open, had been available for some years before 2020, but applying it to those particular specimens with that particular question in mind is what produced the result. This is one of the things that makes paleontology as a field genuinely interesting to follow. It is not only about new discoveries pulled from new excavations, it is also about going back to existing material with new eyes, new tools, and new questions, and finding that the material has more to say than anyone previously realized. There are museum collections around the world full of specimens that have not yet been looked at with a full range of modern methods. Fossils collected in the 19th and early 20th centuries, catalogued and stored, studied with the tools of their time and then set aside. Some of those specimens are waiting for a question that has not been asked of them yet. Some are waiting for a technology that does not quite exist yet. And some, probably, are waiting to overturn something that currently seems settled. That is not a dramatic claim, it is just a description of how the field actually operates, and Tanystropheus is a clear example of it. What the animal itself represents, beyond its own story, is a particular kind of evolutionary success that does not always get the attention it deserves. Tanystropheus was not the largest predator in its ecosystem. It was not the fastest. It was not, by the standards of popular prehistoric animal coverage, especially dramatic. It was a patient, specialised, ecologically precise creature that found a way to make a very unusual body plan work in a very specific environmental context. The long, stiff neck that confused researchers for so long was not a mistake or an anomaly. It was a tool, a very specific tool, shaped by millions of years of selection, suited to a particular kind of hunting in a particular kind of habitat. And it worked well enough to sustain the lineage for an impressive span of time. The Triassic was full of experiments like this. The world was rebuilding after the worst extinction event in Earth's history, and the ecological space was open in ways it had not been for a long time, and would not be again. Body plans that would have been outcompeted in a more crowded ecosystem had room to establish themselves, to persist, to diversify. Longnecks evolved in multiple lineages during this period, in Tanystropheus, in Dinocephalosaurus, in other Triassic reptiles. Not because there was some universal pressure toward longnecks, but because the specific conditions of shallow Tethys lagoon environments happened to reward a particular hunting strategy, and that strategy happened to benefit from a long, stable, forward-extending neck. Convergent evolution in action, across different lineages in different parts of the world, arriving at similar solutions to similar problems. And then the conditions changed, the ecosystems filled in, more agile and maneuverable marine predators established themselves, and the long-necked ambush specialists faded. Not dramatically, not in a single event, just gradually as the ecological window that had made them viable slowly closed. There is something quietly instructive about that. A body plan is not successful in the abstract, it is successful in a context. Change the context, and the same body plan that was a finely tuned adaptation becomes a liability. Tanystropheus was extraordinarily well suited to the warm, shallow, stratified lagoons of the Middle Triassic Tethys. In a different ocean, with different prey communities and different competitors, it probably would not have worked. The neck that was a precision instrument in one setting would have been a burden in another. This is true of many evolutionary solutions, and it is one of the reasons the history of life is so varied. Not because evolution is always finding better solutions in some absolute sense, but because it is always finding solutions that work in the current context, which is a rather different thing. Tanystropheus also reminds us gently that our intuitions about what an animal can look like are not reliable guides to what animals have actually looked like. A neck that accounts for half the total body length of a 6-meter reptile sounds physically implausible until you understand the structural reinforcement of those cervical ribs, the limited mobility that reduced the mechanical demands on the musculature, the water support that made the weight manageable. It sounds ecologically implausible until you understand the ambush hunting model and the specific prey community it was targeting. Plausibility, in the context of deep time, is a moving target. Life has produced solutions that no reasonable person would have predicted in advance, and the fossil record keeps expanding the range of what we know to have actually worked. This particular animal, with its absurd neck and its patient stillness at the edge of a vanished lagoon, is one of the clearer examples of that. It lived, it fed, it raised, in some way we do not yet fully understand, new generations of animals with the same extraordinary proportions. It shared its geographic space with a smaller relative eating completely different prey. It did all of this for millions of years, in a world so ancient that the continents were in different positions, and the seas were arranged differently, and the atmosphere had a different composition. And it left behind enough of itself, in the right kind of sediment, in the right kind of conditions, that we are able to piece together a surprisingly detailed picture of it more than 200 million years later. That is remarkable. Not in a loud way, just quietly, genuinely remarkable. There are other animals like this waiting, not necessarily with long necks, but with stories that are partially told, with fossils that have been collected but not yet fully analysed, with questions that have not yet been properly asked of the material. The Triassic alone is full of them, a period that receives less popular attention than the Jurassic or Cretaceous, but which was in many ways more ecologically interesting, precisely because it was a world in the process of reinventing itself. The animals that lived through that reinvention were often strange by later standards, trying solutions that would not persist, occupying niches that would eventually be filled by different lineages with different body plans. Tanystropheus is one of the more vivid examples, but it is far from the only one. If you have made it this far into the story of this animal, then you already know something that most people do not, that there was a reptile in the Triassic whose neck was as long as the rest of its body, that it was probably an aquatic ambush predator, that it lived alongside a smaller relative with completely different teeth and a completely different diet, and that we only properly understood this in 2020. That is a lot of information to carry about an animal that most people have never heard of. And if any part of it surprised you, the tooth structure, the isotope chemistry, the century of confusion, the UNESCO site on a Swiss-Italian mountain that was once a tropical lagoon floor, then I hope it surprised you in a comfortable way, the kind of surprise that makes the world feel larger and stranger and more interesting than it did before. Thank you for spending this time here, genuinely. These are long journeys into deep time, and I appreciate that you stay for the whole thing. If you found something in this story that stayed with you, the two species discovery, the stiff neck that turned out to be a precision instrument, the fossil sitting in museum drawers for decades waiting for the right question, leave it in the comments. I read them, and I find them interesting. If you are new here and this felt like the kind of thing you would like more of, the subscribe button is there and it is always appreciated. Wherever you are right now, in bed, on a couch, somewhere quiet, somewhere not quite quiet, I hope the night is gentle with you, or the morning, or whatever part of the day this finds you in. Rest well. And somewhere in the back of your mind, if you want it there, you can keep the image of that shoreline, warm, amber-lit, very still, and the long shadow moving just below the surface of a sea that no longer exists.